Good day, Mr. Fawcett. My name is Wanda Patricus. May I call you Shaun?
Yes, please, Wanda, go ahead.
Good. Just a brief recap to make sure that we both have the same understanding. We're recording this interview in English for public access as part of the Atwater Library Living History project, the participants of which are interviewing Montreal, the whole island of Montreal, former residents, workers, as well as those just passing through. So it can sort of cover anybody that has had some connection with the area under study. Your story is of great interest because I understand you currently live in Griffintown, which is a long history of its own on Montreal Island. And I understand you moved there prior to its current 21st century resurgence as a young, hip place to live. I'm probably dating myself with that description, but you also presently operate an online furniture store whose signature pieces are made from recycled materials and all named after streets in Griffintown.
That's all correct. And they're all embedded with a coin to give it authentic.
Why don't you hold it up to the...
authentic.
Hold it up.
Yeah.
Look.
We'll probably
It's a
take
special coin that was
I read about that, and we'll probably take a close-up of it to sort of have it. Thanks. And but most importantly, from our conversations, you appear to be somewhat of a Renaissance man, since you seem to have reinvented yourself many times throughout your working life. Sorry?
I like to say all-round athlete.
Oh, perfect.
Same thing.
Same thing. Renaissance man, all-round athlete.
Yeah.
And one of those careers happened to be as an internet commerce pioneer. So we'll be touching on that. If it's okay with you, perhaps we can start at the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Orillia, Ontario, which is about, it's in the area north of Toronto, called Muskoka, about an hour's drive north of Toronto, maybe really is an hour and a quarter drive north of Toronto. Cottage country. Cottage country,
and did you grow up there, or did you?
Just as a young child I was there, but my dad worked for Ontario Hydro at that time, but then my dad had been overseas during the war. He was the captain of a bomber. And when he came back, he delisted from the Air Force, and then they had a big recruiting drive in the early 50s when I was 3 or 4, and my dad re-enlisted, and we ended up in Nova Scotia. So my formative years from the ages of 3 or 4 to 12 or 13 were in Nova Scotia.
Where in Nova Scotia?
Well, there's an Air Force base in the Annapolis Valley, Greenwood, Nova Scotia. And we were there for 7 or 8 years, and then we moved on to the Halifax, Dartmouth area. We lived on the Dartmouth side, but my dad worked at Maritime Air Command, which was in Halifax.
Was he a pilot, or? Well,
he was a trained pilot, and as I said, he was captain of a bomber during the war. And but once he came, well, when we were in Nova Scotia, actually, he was a search and rescue pilot, okay, for 7 or 8 years. But once we moved to Maritime Air Command, he was more of a safety, became sort of an aviation safety specialist working in the office, but at that time, if you were a pilot and even if you were riding a desk, you had to fly so many hours per month, okay, to keep up your credentials. So he kept that up for many years, but after the search and rescue scene, he essentially did desk jobs, just keeping up his flying credentials on the side.
Did your mother work?
She started off as a school teacher. She did normal school in Ontario after high school, which was the teacher's college in those days. And she taught for 3 or 4 years, and then she married my dad, and then they started raising a family together. Then when I was a teenager in Ottawa, my mom got back into teaching, did a lot of supply teaching for a number of years.
So at what age were you when you moved from Dartmouth to Ottawa?
13 or 14.
Okay, so basically your mid and late adolescence was in Ottawa.
Yes, correct.
That's
yes.
okay.
Yes.
And do you have any special memories about your childhood, like anything that you feel imprinted on you, or something that you did that was different? You mentioned your father was a search and rescue pilot. Did you ever go out on one of the helicopters or something like that? No?
Not really.
No.
No, I wasn't expecting this question, but the only thing that springs to mind, going back to those days, is the annual air show at the Air Force Base in Greenwood. You know, be all these planes flying around, everything of interest to a kid, but at the finale, the grand finale, the climax was there would be a mock submarine in the middle of the airfield, and a plane would come along and bomb it. And this is what all the kids waited for every year to see this. And so I remember that. One other thing I do remember is, it was a terrible tragedy actually. When we were living in Greenwood, a plane crashed right into one of the houses. It was one of my dad's colleagues who was flying his plane. He was killed. So I remember that as well.
So you got the fun and also the tragedy sort of on that. So you obviously went to different schools. Did you have a subject or anything that you excelled in or that you liked, or were you just an ordinary schoolboy at school?
I don't think I was an ordinary schoolboy at school because, well, I think when we moved from Nova Scotia to Ottawa, that was difficult for me. It was right at a difficult age, I think, and I was registered in Ottawa in this high school in this kind of wealthy sort of Westmountish area, Fisher Park area of, and I didn't fit in. I didn't feel comfortable, and I struggled the first couple of years of high school actually.
You were an Air Force brat, really, so you were used to that kind of environment, the military environment, more or less, or not?
Well,
really?
I think it was just more the age, you know, and trying to fit into.
Because you left your friends behind.
I left all my friends behind. That was a big thing, and you know, at that age, you're very awkward making new friends, etc. It was like that. But I did excel even then when I struggled, always in English. I was always. I would always surprise the English teachers when I would hand in my essays, and then often I would get the highest mark in the class, and then all these students would be looking at, oh, we thought this guy was a real dummy, you know? So anyway, so I always excelled in English, yes.
Did you have any favorite sports at school? Was there anything that you liked sports?
In Nova Scotia, I played a lot of baseball, and I was pretty good at it.
Which position did you play?
I was pitcher.
Oh, pitcher.
I was a very skinny, red-headed, freckle-faced pitcher, but I had good control.
And you had a good arm.
And I had a good arm.
Oh,
but very skinny, right? A skinny, gawky kid, but somehow I was a pretty good pitcher. But that ended when we moved to Ottawa. Once we moved to Ottawa, you know, I was always athletic, actually. I was good at sports. Like in gym class, I always kind of stood out. I was just a natural athlete. But I just didn't get into it into organized sports. And then later on, I had a health issue where I was told I couldn't get into certain kinds of sports. So that was when I was 18.
At one point in one of our conversations...
I should mention, I was a good runner. I was a cross-country runner.
Oh, okay.
So I used to excel at cross-country running. Yes.
And did the schools do cross-country running at that time?
Yes, they had a cross-country team at Woodruff High School in the west end of Ottawa. I was on that team for a couple of years. I won the Woodruff Mile one year, I remember that.
What's the Woodruff Mile?
It was just an annual event where anybody in the school could enter, and somehow I won.
Well, this would have been, what, about 10?
I was about 17 at that time.
So it would have been about 10 years after Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile?
Yeah, it would have been actually.
Yeah, about that time.
Exactly.
Because you were born at the end of the 40s,
49.
49, yeah. So, and he was 57, I think. Was it 57 he broke the 4-minute mile?
Around
58?
54, 55, I think.
Oh, okay. Well,
It was just been in the news this week.
yeah, I know.
I think it was 54, 55.
Anyway, so now, did you go to a public school or a private school?
No, I always went to public school.
Oh, you went to public school. And did you do any handicrafts or anything else like that there? Did they have something called shop?
When I was in high school, I was in an academic stream. See, even though I struggled the first couple of years of high school because of adjustments and things, whenever they did testing, they always thought, or they discovered I had like above average IQ, right? So they couldn't understand why I wasn't doing that well, okay, in some subjects, okay? But anyway, I always ended up in the academic stream, but they had this thing in Ontario or Ottawa at that time where you could do academics and then you could have shop options on the side.
And what was shop?
Shop was woodworking.
Yeah.
And you could do automotive if you wanted, because in those days everybody fixed their own cars. And then welding. Okay.
Okay.
Metal. They called it metalworking, but it was mostly welding.
And did you like that?
And yes, I liked it, and I excelled at it. And as a matter of fact, I even won a prize at the Ottawa exhibition, the annual Eastern Canada, Central Canada exhibition that happens every August. Won a prize for a table that I designed and welded. And as a matter of fact, I think my ex-wife still has that table in her home.
Oh, okay. You didn't get it in the breakup.
It's to be passed on to my daughter.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
And
so that's what got me into welding and woodworking, again, which comes into my life later.
Later. Okay. Well, we'll get to that.
Plus, my dad was always a weekend handyman.
Oh, okay. Did you help him with projects or not really?
Whether I liked it or not, because my dad came from sort of a very upright, uptight Anglican, spare the rod, spoil the child kind of philosophy background.
And also he was in the Air Force.
Yeah. And so every weekend when my friends were out playing, I had to be in the garage or in the basement helping my dad with his latest project. Okay.
Well, maybe you.
But I did pick some things up.
I was just going to say, you maybe thank him for it later.
His father was a carpenter, by the way.
Oh, okay. Wow. So he was like first generation military. You didn't come from a military family.
Well, his father had served overseas, but just during the war, yeah. But I couldn't say it was a long time military family, no.
So you finished high school, did you go to, eventually, oh, okay.
I'd say I struggled a bit in high school.
Oh, okay, even towards the end, it wasn't that you...
Well, no, the couple of years I struggled.
Yeah, and then
towards the end I picked it up.
You picked it up. Did you go to university or college?
I went to community college in Ontario at that time. Because by that time I decided I wanted to do something very practical. My mother had talked to me about going to university and taking English and everything, but in my mind, that's not very practical. Even then, I was thinking in those terms, even though I was good at English. Excuse me. So I went to community college and took business. And I discovered, for the first time, in my life, something I was really, really interested in and good at, which was a total surprise and shock, and that was computer programming. Because this was the early days of computer programming.
Would have been very early, so we're talking, what,
around 70?
17? Yeah, that would have been really, really early. I mean, it would have been, wouldn't they have COBOL and Fortran and those languages?
Those languages I learned.
I say that to my son today, and he asked me what kind of language that is. I says, one of the first...
How do you even know those languages? Did you program or what?
No, actually, my first job in Canada was with Control Data, which was the big competitor of IBM. And now you say Control Data and everybody goes, who? But actually they think, and they were the ones that made these huge computers that had their own rooms and apartments and things like that, and special floors. And and I worked with the analysts, so that was my first job.
So I took this 2-year business course, but I specialized in data. They called it data processing at the time. When I came out of it, I ended up not in business. I ended up in research, actually.
But what you said it was community college. Did it have a name?
Algonquin College.
Oh, that's quite famous.
Yeah, it's well known.
Yeah. So you went to Algonquin. You graduated in
about 71, 72.
But what was the diploma?
I have a diploma in business administration, brackets data processing.
Oh, okay. And when you said you ended up in research, who did you work for?
Well, it just so happened that, as I was going through high school, etc., my summer jobs were always construction related, That's another reason why I became sort of handy with my hands. But by the time I turned about 20, when I was at Algonquin College, 1920, and there, I managed to get an office job with the government one summer. Actually, it was through my dad. My dad mentioned it too. My dad was in the government, the Transport Canada at that time. He had left the forces. And through a friend of his, I managed to get this lowly clerical job for a summer, but that led to a career in the government, actually. So I ended up at an organization called the Canadian Transport Commission, which no longer exists. It's been replaced a couple of times. I think it's now the Canadian Transport Agency or something. But at that time, these were the days of heavy-duty regulation in Canada, Pierre Trudeau, Liberals, National Transportation Plan, all of that. So this was like a high-powered research group that I worked for. All these economists, econometricians recruited from the best universities in Canada doing transportation research, and I became a programmer for them. And so I did a lot of programming in Fortran, but I used to work also. I used to run some of the simulation models, etc. So in a way, I was kind of a mini econometrician as well. I learned on the job, So I did that for 4 or 5 years to my mid-20s, I guess.
And looking back, did you enjoy it, or was it just?
No, I enjoyed it. Oh no, I enjoyed it at the time. But after 4 or 5 years of that, I decided I did not want to be a backroom techie for the rest of my life. There was a part of me that wanted to get out there and deal with people, as opposed to, I didn't know doing what, but I just being sort of the backroom techie, I didn't like that idea. But it just so happened that one of my bosses, a man who had been my boss at this research organization, had moved to Transport Canada, which at that time was a massive organization. Okay, they ran every aspect of transportation in Canada. At that time, a lot of that's been divested since then. And he recruited me over to the airport planning branch at Transport Canada. So that led me into a totally different tangent in my career. First of all, I was heading up a data services group, which was basically doing analysis for the airports planning group in Transport Canada. But then I ended up in being a major player in the development of a national computer system across Canada for the management of all hundreds of millions of dollars of capital projects, airport construction projects across Canada at all the airports, etc., etc.
I hope it worked a lot better than the Phoenix payroll system is working now.
Oh, I just shake my head when I hear about that. Oh my word! As a matter of fact, our system, it was called the CADA Project Reporting System, CPRS, and there were two major players, me and a guy who now lives in Nanaimo, BC, who I'm still in touch with. We were the two drivers behind this massive system that got implemented across Canada. Now, we hired consultants. We managed consultants, right, because we couldn't do all the coding ourselves. And you know what? On time, on cost, and it worked after two and a half years.
Wow.
We actually did receive a merit award from the government for that.
Well, that's pretty good. I wouldn't like to be the people who are in charge of Phoenix right now.
And you know what? Consulting companies are just making a fortune from that debacle. They're just counting the money.
So you're now at Transport Canada. Yes. You came up with this system that actually worked.
Yeah.
How long were you there?
Well, I was there, and when that system, by the time I was in my late 20s, that system had been implemented across Canada, so I didn't really need to be directly involved with it. And so I moved to a consulting group within Transport Canada because it was so massive at the time, Transport Canada was, that they even had their own internal consulting group, okay? They sent their consultants to all the regions and sites whenever they needed help on something, whatever. They had 40 or 50 consultants. I joined them for a year or two, and then a guy that I had ended up working with on one of the consulting projects, he ended up being appointed. This was just around the time Hibernia oil field had been discovered off of Newfoundland, okay, early 80s. And Transport Canada ran the airport there, owned the airport, operated the airport in St. John's.
Newfoundland.
And St. John's, Newfoundland. And it was not prepared for the development and exploration or development of offshore oil, which looked like it was going to be happening. it was just this backwater airport essentially at that time. So Transport Canada set up a special project team, and it just so happened I had worked with the guy who was appointed project manager, who I just, believe it or not, just signed a contract with this week.
Oh, okay.
Many years later on something else. But anyway, so I went to St. John's, Newfoundland for 2 years to work on this project team as manager of project control and administration. Because of my writing skills, I became the primary author of this master plan, airport master plan too. So I was able to use my writing skills there.
Wow. And that was also the beginning of a career, because it was at the time when a lot of airports were being brought up, and it was quite a consulting area to be in.
So at that time I was still an employee of Transport Canada, right?
Yeah.
But it was a few years later, maybe 10 years later, that the whole movement happened across Canada, where most of the airports, major airports, and even medium airports were divested to local communities. Okay, and Transport Canada no longer owned them or operated them. But at that time, they ran the whole show.
They ran everything.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's good. It sort of centers it in time, so,
Yeah.
so that helps us.
So that was 2 years in St. John's.
Can I interrupt for a minute? Did you like living in Newfoundland? We always think of it
fascinating.
as-
Loved it. Yeah, for 2 years it was great. Thank God for the CBC though, because it connected me, it kept me connected with the rest of Canada. Because after a while, well, have you spent time in Newfoundland at all?
No, but
Okay,
I have some connections there.
If you ever do,
yeah.
if you ever go there and spend any time there at all, you will realize that it is much more different from the rest of Canada than even Quebec is, okay?
Yeah.
And you can tell Quebecers this too. You can tell French Quebecers this. It's a unique place, and I think every Canadian should have to live there for 2 years. And then they would stop complaining about anything, because these people live very close to the land and the water and the sea.
Yeah, it's quite, and you can see that anytime you meet somebody from Newfoundland, they are very special. They're just special. They have an outlook on life, and it's like something.
Yeah, so loved it for the 2 years there. Oh, I forgot to mention. Yeah, my daughter was born there. But by this time, I'd gotten married. I should probably tell you about that.
Yes. That's kind of interesting that your daughter was born there. My son's father was from Newfoundland. So,
okay. Well,
it's kind of the connection. Anyway,
we've covered career-wise, but
well, we covered up to career, up to a certain. We can come back to the career. Let's go on then to the marriage.
Well, okay, but that was the second marriage.
Yes,
the thing is, when I was initially, when I was in my early 20s, married my high school sweetheart. Okay, Lydia. We fell in love in high school. We were the perfect couple. We went out together for 5 or 6 years. I was, from the time I was 18 to 23, got married at 23. She was probably 21. This was the 70s, okay, when everything was kind of exploding. Hedonism was in, traveling the world was just coming in, etc. Margaret Trudeau was, doing her thing. And so we were together for 5 years, but essentially it was 5 years of sort of partying and not really having a plan or a direction. It was just like a couple sort of hanging out together, having fun, but not grabbing onto anything. And then Lydia decided she wanted to travel the world. So our marriage dissolved. I was very upset because I had no plan B, because I had been brought up in a traditional Air Force 3 kids family. I had a brother and a sister. I was the oldest of 3. And white picket fence, suburbia, this wasn't going to happen for me. And
so it affected you badly.
Anyway, it did, but I recovered from it. But I went through a period where I ended up moving into a house in downtown Ottawa with a buddy, and it was party time, party central for a couple of years in my late 20s, 30ish in there. And then at one point, a very good friend of mine who I worked with at that time when I was in my late 20s was from India. His name was Ranjan. And his sister had come over to live in Ottawa as well. And at one time, his sisters had gone to boarding school in India. They were like a wealthy, well, not wealthy, well, relatively speaking, in India. His father was a group captain in the Air Force, okay, so they lived a good life over there, went to private schools, etc. His sister had gone to boarding school over there, and her friends would come and visit her. Long story short, I met one of her friends at one point who came to visit her in Ottawa, one of her Indian friends, and we sort of got involved. And at that time, to tell the truth, it was partly in my mind escaping from, emotionally from my previous childhood sweetheart, because I hadn't fully resolved that in my mind. So anyway, I found this other woman who was sort of enthralled with me, and we ended up in this sort of back and forth relationship. Long story short, she went back to New York, where she was living with her sister and brother-in-law, and then she went back to India, and we might not have ever seen each other again, but when I was 30, I was going through, I felt that I was 30, my God, my life is passing me by. Yeah, I really did think that. And so I actually wrote her a letter and said, why don't you come back over here and we'll try it out for a year, living together. So she did. And anyway, that led to a year later, well, I had to sponsor her into the country with a promise to marry, okay, and there was a 1-year time limit on that, and then after that 1 year passed, we had a month to make up our mind. And so even though we did not get along well during that year, I have to tell you that truthfully. But I always tried to do the right thing, okay?
It was that white picket fence.
Yes,
still
exactly.
calling.
I was still trying to do the right thing. And she wanted to get married in her father's home in India.
Which was where?
Delhi.
Delhi.
Yes, and it turns out, which I didn't know at the time, it turns out her family was very wealthy, very influential in India, okay? But I didn't know, I just knew her father was a businessman in India, that's essentially all I knew. But anyway, long story short, I agreed. So I went to India and we got married there. I went through the whole traditional Hindu marriage and everything. This was in 1981.
Who kept the photos?
Well, it was videotaped and everything, which at that time was like...
Was quite something.
Yeah. Her family, I think, still has those stash somewhere. And I have a few lying around in old boxes and things. But my ex-wife, we're divorced now, she has a lot of old photos and things. She lives in Ottawa now. Anyway, so, yeah, so... You had
this amazing wedding.
So this was when I was living in, just before going to Newfoundland. She came back, after we got married, about a month after. I came back early. I had to come back right away because of work. She came back after we, sorting things out. And about 6 months after that, within a few months, I got this opportunity to go to Newfoundland. So we moved to Newfoundland together. So my newfie daughter has an Indian mother. Okay.
Yeah, and I must say that must have been a culture shock for your wife moving to Newfoundland.
It was, but the thing is that she was highly educated. She had a master's from Columbia. She grew up in a wealthy family, Western education, etc. But there were cultural differences. But it wasn't like she was like from a village or something.
No, but I'm just saying Newfoundland.
But
for somebody from India.
Yeah, it was an adjustment for me, so it was certainly an adjustment. Yes. Okay. So we've now caught up to career and marriage. In '81, so I moved back to Ottawa because after 2 years on that project team, we delivered the draft master plan. I decided it was time to come back because there were no big challenges left there anymore in that job. And so I had gone there on a special arrangement with Transport Canada that they would find something for me somewhere in the organization when I left the project team. And it just so happened that around that time, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board had just been newly created, okay? That was the first time Canada was ever going to have an organization that would independently investigate, independent of Transport Canada, investigate airplane crashes, okay? Because prior to that, the Fawcett had been in charge of the hen house, Transport Canada had been investigating itself, okay?
Could you explain, there was an incident, I think, in Cranbrook in BC that sort of was
Well, yes.
Yeah. And there was some involvement with your father there too, so that was an interesting story.
Okay, you remember this, okay. Okay, the backstory to that, to the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, is that in the late, around 78, 79 somewhere, there was an airplane crash in Cranbrook, BC. I think it was the 727. It was coming in, Pacific Western Airlines at that time. It was coming into land on at the runway in Cranbrook, BC. There was no control tower there. There was what's called a flight service station, okay, which means a guy sitting in a windowless room, communicating with the airplane, and also controlling anything that was on the runway. This was the time when Transport Canada still ran everything, only ran the airport, so they ran Cranbrook Airport. What happened there is that there was a series of errors happened that led to this crash, but anyway, sort of the major error that happened is that there was a snowplow on the runway. He was told to clear the runway, meaning get off the runway. He thought it meant to go and plow the runway.
Oh dear.
Okay? So he drove out.
I don't mean to laugh,
No,
but it's that,
it is.
you know, the English language. Clear the runway in one sense and clear the runway in the
That just
other.
goes to show, and that led to the deaths of 40-some people, right?
Oh my goodness.
Because what happened is the plane was coming in, he was on final approach, just coming, ready to touch down. He saw the snowplow, knew he was going to hit him, so he initiated a go-around. But then, here's another thing, you know, it's always a series of events. He did something wrong in the cockpit in this way, the way he recovered it. Ultimately, the plane crashed as a result of this sequence of events, okay? Anyway, long story short, because Transport Canada owned the airport, because they operated it, because they were in charge of the flight service station, there was a Transport Canada employee there, there was a Transport Canada contractor on the runway, they were heavily implicated in this crash. Now, when a crash like this happens, or next of kin, both private and corporate interests want to sue. Well, they want to lay blame and they want to sue parties. Well, Transport Canada was being sued out the yin-yang, if you will. And what happened, but the problem with that is that the primary aircraft accident investigation group in Canada belonged to Transport Canada. Now, just by happenstance, it just so happened that my father, Harold Arthur Fawcett, was the chief aircraft accident investigator in Canada. He was in charge of this group at this time of this Cranbrook thing. Now, my dad and his merry band of investigators, they were just all former pilots who had an interest in aviation safety, essentially. Their credo, whenever they investigated an accident, they would one of the key, if there were survivors or witnesses, whatever it was, interviewing these witnesses, they would always tell them, no matter what happens, whatever you tell us in this interview is going to be absolutely between you and I. It will never go to anybody for litigational purposes. It will never end up in a court of law. It will never end up in a police station, because it's to improve aviation safety. We're here to help to make sure accidents don't happen in the future. And this was their way of gaining the confidence of these people, right? Saying, tell us anything and it's not going to go beyond us and it's for safety purposes only. Well, guess what? They had, as my dad and his people conducted the Cranbrook investigation, well, they interviewed all of the various parties and players. They had all kinds of confidential statements from them that they'd given on this basis. And suddenly, lawyers at Department of Justice, lawyers at Transport Canada who worked for Department of Justice, plus senior people at Transport Canada, all of a sudden wanted access to these confidential statements. And my dad, being a very principled guy he was, said, F you aren't getting them. And his merry band of men also said that, because these guys really believed in this whole thing about the confidentiality, etc. So they refused. So what happened is the senior people at Transport Canada and Department of Justice called in the RCMP, and my dad and his people, their offices were raided and they were suspended from their jobs. Okay?
Okay.
And these people, this all happened around 78, 79 in there. So anyway, long story short, what happened is that led to the government, because this was such like a public thing at the time, calling for a public inquiry into aviation safety in Canada.
The Dublin
Headed up
Inquiry.
by
The Dublin
Chief
Inquiry.
Justice Charles Dublin. Okay, it became known as the Dublin Inquiry. Anyway, it went on for a year and a half, 2 years. Chief Justice Dublin, interviewed many, many people, including my dad and his cronies and anybody else involved in the whole aviation safety thing. And at the end of all this, one of the many recommendations was that an independent tribunal be created, independent of any government department or agency, to investigate aviation crashes in Canada. Okay, so which is what my dad and his guys had always wanted, okay? And it also had a recommendation that Harold A. Fawcett be an integral part of the formation of this new organization, okay? So my dad was sort of, let off the hook, and he was, in the end, he did carry over to the new agency, but he was heading towards retirement at that time, so he just became a senior advisor, okay? So, how did I get there? Okay, so that was the background. So Cranbrook happened, Independent Safety Board. Excuse me. So that was about 1983, early 84. I was just coming
Took
back.
that long from the time of the inquiry to
the inquiry, the drafting of the legislation, all of that, yeah. I think it would actually officially, became legal. The legislation was enacted in early 84, so I recall. Anyway, I was just coming back from St. John's. It just so happened I knew 2 or 3 of the people in this new safety board because they'd been picked out from various parts of Transport Canada. I had worked for a couple of them actually. My dad was there, but this had nothing to do with my dad. As a matter of fact, I had to meet with my dad and ask him if he felt okay with me coming up there. So they asked me to come up and help set up the new safety board. So that's how I got back into the Ottawa area. That's how I got into aviation safety. So what happened there is the Canadian Aviation Safety Board became a sort of a trial case for if it was, the government's plan was if this independent aviation board is successful, we're using it as the model to create ultimately a multimodal transportation safety board, which after 4 or 5 years was created, which we now have the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, which is multimodal.
And what you mean by multimodal is it's not just
It's
air, it's
rail,
train,
marine, air,
Do you have any others?
pipelines.
Oh, pipelines, so they come
Yes.
under that?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you moved back to Ottawa. Did you
Right.
move back? Which area did you move back to in the city?
To the west end of Ottawa, we bought a house, had a young baby, and then I started, beavering away with the safety board, and, I
Any highlights from your time there that you can talk
Well,
about? Or
I-
not
well,
really? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I helped to start it from scratch. So there was
Yeah.
a lot of, but I would say the thing that was kind of interesting is that for the first time ever, this new safety board had the authority, the legal authority to conduct public inquiries into aviation occurrences. And it just so happened that the first chairman appointed and the first board members appointed were very keen about this particular part of the legislation. And during the first couple of years of the safety board, they actually called for a number of public inquiries, and I became the person who set up these inquiries and wrote the manual on how to run these public inquiries. Okay, so I managed their first 3 or 4 public inquiries and wrote the book on it, and some of those were high profile too. Like there was a famous one involving Grant Notley, who was Rachel Notley, his daughter, is now the premier of Alberta.
That's
Her
right.
father was killed in an airplane crash, which happened near Grand Prairie, Alberta. We held a public inquiry into that, and I managed that public inquiry.
Was the Gimli glider one of those? Or was
no,
that later?
No.
That was the Air Canada
There was
plane?
no public inquiry into that, I don't think.
Okay, it was just a...
Yeah.
it was
Anyway,
just a
there
protocol.
were 2 or 3, three major high-profile public inquiries I was involved in setting up and organizing and documenting. And then I got, because of my time at the safety board, the aviation safety board, I was heavily involved in drafting the legislation for the multimodal board as well, and then helping to set it up. And I ended up, working for that board for about 7 years before I ended up coming to Montreal.
But prior to that, I think you took an executive MBA?
Oh, okay. Well, while I was working for the Aviation Safety Board, then Transportation Safety Board, around early 90s, when I was, the Transportation Safety Board had been created by the early 90s, I applied at the University of Ottawa for their executive MBA program, and the Transportation Safety Board sponsored me. So they paid half of my tuition, I paid the other half, and that was one of these executive MBA programs where it happens over like about a 22-month period, where you keep working away in your job. You might have to get, I forget what the schedule was, but I think every second Friday I had to go and attend classes. But also while you're working, you're still getting 15 to 25 to 30 hours a week of assignments and things. So
it was a tough
2 years.
It's a tough 2 years.
Yeah.
And did you have any particular impetus for doing that, for choosing to do that? Because I know it's not easy to work full time and go to school.
I guess I always had this thing that I didn't have a university degree. I had this diploma from community college. But also it just seemed like if I wanted to progress further, personally, I was at a very good place in my life. Okay, a few years before that, I removed alcohol from my life. My marriage had broken up, but things were stabilized in terms of access to my daughter, etc. So I was just sort of looking forward, and I had seen a couple of people, colleagues, do this executive MBA thing, and it just struck me as something I would like to do.
And did you, in fact, enjoy it?
Oh, absolutely. It was challenging, but I loved the 2 years from '94 to '96. It was Ottawa U at their executive classroom downtown. There were two groups, about 25 per group. I ended up tied for second in my class after 2 years. Then I was offered a job in Montreal at the end of all of that.
And you would have been about what age at this time?
Mid-40s.
Mid-40s, okay, so it's
So
perfect time to make a
45.
move. You
Yeah.
were leaving...
And also I was just clicking by 25 years with the Feds, because I'd started very early as, in like 70 or 71, you see, so 25 years seemed to be a nice break, and also I could maintain most of my pension, that I'd accumulated with the Feds at that time. So that worked out well.
So what was the job you were offered in Montreal?
Okay, there's a bit of a backstory to that too. Yeah. When I was at the Transportation Safety Board, the chap that I went down to St. John's, Newfoundland with, he had come back to Ottawa. He was working in a director's job in Transport Canada. And anyway, at that time, the Government of Canada, in conjunction with the Government of Quebec and CEDA, the Government of Canada represented by CEDA, I guess.
And CEDA is the
Canadian International Development Agency, the company that sort of hands out or manages a lot of Canada's aid funding to developing countries. Anyway, some studies had been done, and they had decided that in developing countries around the world, in aviation, there were a lot of technical specialists and a lot of technical training, but there was no management training. So they decided it would be a good idea if Canada, sort of as being a leader in the world in this, would set up a management training institute for aviation managers, to service developing countries particularly. So it just so happened the guy that I had gone down to join in St. John's, Newfoundland as project manager, he came back, they asked him to be executive director of this. This was in '87. so prior to my MBA and all of that, but he had, and it was of course rush thing. They had to set them up. They were going to, like one summer they were going to set it up, and then by that fall they were going to be running their first courses for people from developing countries, and it was going to be set up in Montreal. So
is there a reason for that?
Montreal being international aviation capital.
Well, also because
ICAO here, IATA here.
IATA's here.
Yes,
yeah.
ICAO particularly.
Yeah.
So Montreal was a logical choice. And so anyway, this guy asked me if I could come down for 6 or 8 months to help him get this thing started. And so I managed to get a
leave of absence.
Thank you. A leave of absence from the Transportation Safety Board to come down and help them set it up. That was in '87, 6 or 7 months. And then I went back to my job. So they started running their courses. And then over the years while they were operating, I used to come and lecture sometimes on project management, things like that. I used to do the odd consulting contract for them when they were trying to.
What was the name of the?
I'm sorry. The organization, which no longer exists, but at that time it was called the International Aviation Management Training Institute, IAMT, and it was a 2001 university on the top floor. Anyway, so that I helped set that up. Then I went back, helping with the Transportation Safety Board, did the MBA thing, and at the end, I had kept in touch with my friend who was the head of this, or the executive director of this IMT, and he knew what I was doing. He knew I was doing the MBA thing, and at the end of it, he offered me this job as executive director of corporate services and marketing corporate services.
So he got you. He got you into the business end of things.
I was in charge of finance and marketing for this organization. It wasn't a huge organization, like they had about annual budget was like about $3 million. They had about 35 to 40 employees, but they did run courses all over the world. Sometimes students would come in from these developing countries to IAMT's classroom. Sometimes IAMT would do the training, in these countries. So that's how
you would first come to Montreal for your 7-month stint, and what did you think of the city? Where did you live, for instance? Were you in a hotel?
Well, I lived in an apartment hotel in Sherbrooke. Yeah,
Campus?
It's still there. No. Right across Sherbrooke Street from the Delta President Kennedy. It's called L'Appartement.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I had known Montreal before that because from living in Ottawa from the time I was in my 20s, especially with my Indian friend Ranjan, he and I became friends working together. We were both totally into music, okay? And we were both record collectors. So we used to come to Montreal, and we'd spend a Saturday, and sometimes a Saturday in, well, I don't know if the record stores, anyway, we would come to Montreal for a day or two on a weekend, and would tour around the record stores along St. Catherine Street and whatever.
They used to have great record stores.
We'd look for deleted, deletes. They used to cut the corner of the record, and these were discontinued. So and they'd go for like $1.99 for a delete, and these were hard to get. Anyway, and also Montreal at that time had some jazz clubs as well. Okay, and I was really into jazz and things like that. So there was a place called In Concert in Montreal.
It's called what?
It was called In Concert. It operated.
In Concert, I remember. Yes,
It was an amazing place.
Yes, it was.
It was an incredible place. I still can remember walking in there to see Gato Barbieri, and it had all these chrome chairs, and it had the kind of hazy, smoky atmosphere the jazz clubs did at that time, and the sound system was blasting up Moondance by, Van Morrison's Moondance, okay?
Oh, yeah, Van Morrison, yes, of course, yes.
Anyway, long story, I knew Montreal from, sort of weekend visits, and also, at that time, I was also, from the time I was 17 years old.
We appear to have lost, there's a lot of construction outside, because this whole area is, I don't know, stuff's coming down, the streets are blocked, it's like a nightmare. So we're going to continue the interview without the lights.
Okay.
So it's probably, maybe we could have a candle or something, but, so let's go back. We left you in the music stores collecting, collecting
I was
records.
explaining my connection with Montreal started in my early 20s.
Yeah.
But there was also another connection. There was coming the record runs to Montreal. But also, I should mention that when I was a teenager in Ottawa, I was sort of, as I told you, I had trouble adjusting when we moved from Nova Scotia, and I was one of these sort of angsty type teenagers. So I became sort of a poet. Became interested in poetry, and through the mother of a friend of mine, these were Montrealers that moved to Ottawa, I discovered, I heard about this man called Leonard Cohen when I was 17 years old.
Okay.
And this woman loaned me one of her books. I think it might have been Let Us Compare Mythologies, his very first poetry book, and I became totally enthralled with Leonard Cohen and his work as a poet. This was even before he was known as a singer-songwriter. And so part of coming to Montreal over the years was always hanging around the either Old Montreal or the
Plateau.
No.
You didn't go to the Plateau?
No. He used to hang up around the
McGill.
the Golden
The Golden Square Mile.
The Golden Square Mile. And
Okay.
there were certain places like the Pam Pam and Rainbow Bar and Grill were places that he was known to hang out. Okay, so we were always looking for Leonard Cohen sightings. Okay, that was always a thing, a secondary thing after the records.
Yeah, and this
And,
would have been the time he was back and forth from Hydra, around that time.
Maybe even just before Hydra, yeah.
Because he was,
Yeah.
because he went to McGill, of course.
I was 20. He would have been 35. No, actually, it was when he was back and forth between
From
Hydra and
Hydra,
Montreal.
yeah.
You're right. I'm
Quite-
just reading his Sylvie Simmons biography right now.
Oh, okay. I just read a New York Times article
Well, yeah.
where the writer called him the secular saint of Montreal.
That was in yesterday's New York Times.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, that's going around the internet all over mine. Well, as we'll talk about later, I do
Yeah,
have another.
we'll get onto
another
that part.
connection. Yeah.
Okay,
So-
so you do have some knowledge. You come here for 7 months to do a contract with
Right.
Amity, and then they offer you a job,
Now-
and you move here.
During the 7 months I was on the contract, I loved Montreal because, at that time, that was right around the time I was separating from my second wife, okay? The mother of my daughter,
And her name was
Sherry, Mandira, but everybody calls her Sherry.
Sharon. Okay.
So we were in the process of separating at that time. I had actually moved out in Ottawa, and when I was recruited to come to Montreal for that 6 or 7 months, we were actually separated. But then there was one of these breaks are never clean, so there was kind of a back and forth period, especially with a child.
And how did Layla adapt? Did she?
Well, she was very young at that time, okay. Trying to remember where I was going with that. During that 6 or 8 months, I spent most of my time either working at this institute, because we had a lot of get done in a very short period of time, or hanging out in Biddles.
Oh, in Biddles.
Okay.
Okay.
Because in those days I was still drinking, and Biddles was this jazz club, and I didn't have many friends in Montreal at that time, so I would, after a long day's work, I would hang out in Biddles, and I listen to jazz all night and drink beer, and that was a sort of, what I did in those days.
Do you remember any of the artists playing at that time that you particularly liked?
Charlie Biddle in particular,
Yeah.
and as a matter of fact, he and I sort of became friendly, and years later, he lived about a block away from me in Notre Dame, the years before he died. One thing I do remember about Charlie Biddle, he played stand-up bass, right?
That's right.
Well, I'll tell you, he had the strongest, steeliest grip I have ever felt in my life. I guess from those years of playing the bass with his right hand, his handshake was like, wow. It was like grabbing a piece of steel.
Wow.
And there was one particular singer who I understand died years ago. His name was Johnny Scott.
Oh, I remember Johnny Scott.
And I loved him, and every time he would always play Around Midnight for me, okay?
Yeah.
And he did a very nice version of Around Midnight. Anyway, so that was sort of that. And then
When you came back?
And then in '96, when I was offered the job, of course I was moving here permanently, and that was the idea. Now, at that time, my daughter was 12 or 13, so I actually sat down with her and asked her permission if it was okay with her if I came to Montreal, because even though her mother and I had been separated for divorce for a number of years, I had always had constant contact with her. She was with me every second weekend and one day during every week, and we had this constant contact always. So we were pretty close. But I knew I'd be moving to Montreal, so Leila was excited about this because she was just at that age where this seemed like an adventure. And so for the next 4 or 5 years, every second weekend she would take the bus to Montreal, and we'd spend the weekend together in Montreal. And ultimately, she ended up going to McGill, and she now lives in Montreal. She's never actually really left Montreal since she started at McGill back in 2001, 2002.
And what does she do now?
She's teaching at a school in Westmount here called Villa St. Marceline.
Oh, yeah.
She's teaching English as a second language. She got her undergrad in secondary education at McGill.
In what subjects?
Secondary education.
Oh,
teaching, secondary school teaching.
Oh, okay, I understand.
And then she went to Japan, the JET program, Japanese government training program, where they bring students from all over the world to merge them into their education system over there. So she was over in Hiroshima for 2 years.
And did she...
during which I went to visit her for...
And did she enjoy it?
Oh, she loved it, yeah.
And she taught English as a second language?
Well, she was... Well, basically, the reason that the JET program exists over in Japan is it's not just about English. It's like after the Second World War, Japan was humiliated, shamed, defeated, because they were a very warlike nation before.
That's right.
They realized living in this island bubble they'd lived in for all these years, they weren't in touch with the rest of the world, and they understood that they needed to reach out. And so shortly after the Second World War, I guess, they set up this JET program.
I've never heard of that. Could you explain it a bit? What does it stand for?
Well, I think it stands for Japanese Education Training, something like that. Okay. Or Japanese Exchange Training, something along those lines. If you look it up online. Anyway, it's a fascinating program because what they do is they bring in thousands of students from around the world, from English-speaking countries. I think it's English-speaking, okay? But they don't have to be English students, okay? Just English-speaking in any discipline. They fill out these detailed applications, they get interviewed, and every year they fly in thousands of them into all the different prefectures of Japan. Leila ended up in Hiroshima, which was fascinating.
Is it a program that still goes on?
Oh yeah, still going strong. Oh, yeah. It's been going for years and it's still going strong. Leila could have stayed for up to 5 years. Okay, she stayed for 2. Some of her friends stayed for 4 or 5. The people, she met at that time. But essentially, when in Hiroshima, she didn't teach. She was like a resource person, and so she would go to 3 different schools in a week. Okay, she would spend 2 days here, 2 days here, 1 day here, and she would be like a resource person. And she would get involved in some of their programs and things as a kind of an English-speaking Western resource person. Okay, so and that program's still going strong. So anyway,
So she did that, and then she returned.
And then she returned, and she did her master's in developmental psychology, which is essentially, dealing with special needs, setting up a curriculum.
And where did she do that?
At McGill also.
Oh, at McGill.
So she double McGill grad, and then she started her, teaching career. It's hard to get a full-time teaching gig, so she did, taught here, taught there. Last year she did a maternity leave fill-in at Collège Stanislas, which is one of these international schools in Outremont.
That's right.
She filled in on maternity leave there, and then through my squash partner, it's another long story, but anyway, through my squash partner's daughter, who goes to Villa St. Marceline, I found out about an opening at Villa St. Marceline. I found out a couple of teachers were retiring. I told Leila, my daughter, immediately. She immediately applied, like unannounced, unadvertised, and within 3 weeks they had hired her.
Oh, great.
And so, yeah, so she's been
there.
enjoying that.
And when you moved here full-time, where did you,
Oh,
from
okay.
Ottawa, where did you move to?
I just had one weekend essentially to look for a place. So came down with Leela. I made sure Leela came with me, and we looked for a place together. Real estate agent who I had been connected with spent the weekend showing us around. And she showed us a lot of Nuns Island, okay, at first. But the thing I didn't like about Nuns Island, it was very pretty and idyllic and everything, but it was, your life would be run by bridges, is how I saw it, okay?
And
so I was
mode of transport of stuff. You don't just walk off Nuns Island.
Well, whatever, I always drive a car. I have a car, so, but still, I didn't want my schedule to be run by bridges or, by traffic patterns all the time. And then the real estate agent had to stop by her house to pick something up. It was on Notre Dame, near Guy, and on one side of Notre Dame at that time, this is even 20 years ago, there were all these nice three-level condo buildings, okay, that are still there. And she went in there, and I said, well, what about one of these places? And there was a for sale sign Leela had seen. So we went and looked at this place, and I ended up renting a place right on Notre Dame. Excuse me, a second floor condo with a beautiful
near the corner of where?
Near Guy.
Near Guy.
Just very close to Guy. And beautiful view from the back of the downtown. But I used to, at that time, I told my colleagues in Montreal, where I started working, Montrealers, where I, taken an apartment, and they'd look at me like, why would you ever move down there? Because to them, this was just like an abandoned industrial area filled with railway tracks and old factories. And they had written it off in their minds long before. And I said, well, I have a nice condo there. I like it, and I love old industrial areas. Okay, these people hadn't even been down there in many, many years. It wasn't even on the radar. Anyway, it just so happened that just down the block from me, there was a little cafe called the Griffintown Cafe. I had no idea what this was, but I asked the owner at one point, I said, well, what's this Griffintown all about? He says, well, you're living in Griffintown. I said, what? I never heard of this. No one told me this. And that was the only mention of Griffintown anywhere.
Yeah,
that's when I started to become fascinated, interested, and curious. And then some couple of histories came out in Griffintown, and anyway, I became sort of a student of the history of Griffintown over the years. So not only did I explore the entire industrial area, and I loved the feel of it, the grittiness of it, and everything. And then after Leela graduated from McGill and moved to Japan, I had decided I didn't want to keep renting. I wanted to see if I could afford to live downtown somewhere, close to downtown. And sure enough, it was just around that time that Preval, one of the initial developer in Griffintown actually, was redoing the old Lowney chocolate factories, buildings 1 and 2, converting them to condos. And so I looked at those, and I was interested in those, but I wasn't quite ready, didn't quite have a down payment together, whatever. But then about a year later, I went back, and they had just decided they were going to build phases 3 and 4 as a new build right next to phases 1 and 2. And so I immediately put a deposit on one in Lowney phase 3, and that's where I live now. So I've lived there for 9 years in the Lowney development.
So we got to you moved into the Lowney project, or you just put down the down payment on the Lowney project 3. What's the difference between the old chocolate factory and the new build in terms of style or whatever? Would you have preferred the older building, or are you quite happy in the new building?
Well, the older building, it's an actual factory building, so it has the very high ceilings, like 10, maybe 10 foot, 12 foot ceilings. So it has the true loft look and feel to it because it is that style. I would have liked to maybe get a unit in there, but there are pluses to where I've moved. Okay, it's a new build. My ceilings aren't as high, but they're higher than standard ceilings by 6 or 8 inches, and they're exposed concrete, so you do have sort of a lofty look and feel to it. Plus, I'm on the 9th floor, and I have a beautiful view of Old Montreal. I'm looking east, which from the other Lowney's Phase 1 and 2, those buildings, they don't have the greatest views, okay? They're either blocked by our buildings or blocked by other buildings, so I have a much better view. Plus, the developer, Prevel, they invented this whole urban chalet concept, which is
urban chalet?
Okay, that's the term they used when they marketed these things in the first place, and then essentially the rooftop of all of the buildings, everybody's followed suit, okay? They had to, but Prevel set the standard, set the bar. And essentially there's a swimming pool on the roof, barbecue areas, recreation areas, party areas, etc. Okay, and all these developers, each time they do another building, they try to one-up the previous buildings. Okay, so ours was one of the first. So at the time, ours seemed very fancy, but now it's nothing compared. My daughter lives in Phase 10, and they have even a fancier rooftop over there. Okay. But anyway, this whole urban chalet concept thing caught on. And now if you look at any of the new buildings that have been built in Griffintown in the last 5 years, these condo buildings, they all have that thing happening.
It's interesting with the major condo construction boom going on in Montreal. Prevel happens to still be in the forefront, and they're in fact building just across the road here on the former Franciscan Priory, and they're putting up 2 20-story towers, sort of overshadowing the Masson and the Judah houses. Right. So it's going to be an interesting development, and then across the road on the Children's Hospital site is going to be 6 more buildings. Right. So this is going to be sort of condo central.
And it just so happens the Prevel sales manager in the project you mentioned on Rennie Levesque there, he lives in my building, and he's the guy who sold me my unit in the first place.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe you'll be moving up to
Robert Rosenberg.
Oh, Robert Rosenberg.
He's a very, very nice guy.
Anyway, so okay, so you've moved, you've put your down payments.
I got more into the whole heart and fabric of Griffintown when I moved into the Lowney project, because now I had a connection with the history. Because before I was living in Notre Dame, you know, within the limits of Griffintown, but there was nothing historical about where I lived or no historical connection. It just so happened that Lowney was one of the companies involved during the Griffintown boom between the 1850s and early 1900s, okay, the industrial boom there.
Well, just to clarify something, the land that your first condo you rented on were the old rail yards. Yes. So in actual fact, it does have the land itself has a connection, because it was really,
that's true.
And that was like the first big development, except they didn't go high-rise, they went low-rise, you know, with the buildings.
Yeah.
Now it's really quite a nice neighborhood, lots of greenery and gardens, because they put in a lot of townhouses. Anyway, we're back to Griffintown. You immersed yourself in the history, you bought in what's actually now going to be, it's really quite a hopping part of town, Griffintown, you know, with all the buildings. And what did you do then? You were...
Well, okay, that's personally, so that takes me up to now, personally, or to a couple of years ago, but professionally, I should go back now to when I came to Montreal in '96, moved to Notre Dame in Griffintown. That international agency that I came to work for here in Montreal, it essentially disappeared after 18 months. Okay, it was the 10-year anniversary, and the governments, for whatever reasons, decided to end their funding. Essentially, that institute trained managers, aviation managers from around the world. The way the institute got funded was for every manager we trained from a listed country, we got funded for every training day, okay? So it's only thousands of dollars, whatever. And that's how the IMT got half of its income. And after 10 years, the government decided it was no longer a priority, whatever. So I found myself out of a job in 1998, 97, 98. Suddenly, for the first time in my life, here I am in Montreal with an MBA and no job. And 3 months severance, that was it.
And who took over that role?
So what happened is that part of it was absorbed by IATA.
The International Air Transport Association, which is the trade association
for
of
the
the
airlines.
International Airlines.
And
Yeah.
then another part of it was absorbed by ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization,
Which is the UN body that
sets the
sets the
standard,
laws.
worldwide aviation standards. Okay,
Yeah.
so they had a training unit. They absorbed part of what IMT did. IATA absorbed part, and then the rest fell through the cracks.
Okay, so now you're faced with,
So
you're in your late 40s by this time, mid to
Right.
late 40s,
Right.
and you're faced with, what do I do with the rest of my life?
exactly,
Okay,
you got it.
okay, so
That's it.
what did you do?
Well, initially, aside from panicking, because also I had this daughter who was ultimately probably going to be coming to Montreal to live with me to go to McGill, and I was worried because I only had 3 months severance. I had no savings.
And you just bought a new apartment? Or
No, this before.
Oh, this was before, okay.
Okay, so but what happened is that I sort of half-heartedly looked for another job, you know, like, but I wasn't, my heart wasn't into it. I had always been, even when I had my government jobs, okay, I had always been sort of an entrepreneurial kind of a spirit. And even with my government jobs, I was always helping with startup and starting up a project team in St. John's, starting up an aviation safety board, starting up a transport. So it was always startups. It wasn't government paper pushing, okay? So, and also a few times I wanted to start, I was almost left the government to start my own publishing company when desktop publishing came in. I almost started my own welding business in my 20s. So I always had this entrepreneurial spirit. So finally I thought, okay, maybe the universe is telling me something here. It just so happened that while I was doing my MBA, that was just the time that the internet was starting to become a household word, okay? And a couple of my projects when I was doing my MBA did involve looking at what people were doing online and how they were setting up businesses. And I realized that there were individuals who were starting to make a living online, okay? So what I did was, for a couple of years after I lost that IMT job, I did a lot of business consulting through contacts I had. I did copywriting. I wrote for a men's lifestyle magazine for a couple of years. You know, and
using that English that you always had.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was called Men's Magazine. Anyway, it turns out it was a front for Mount Real. This guy Lino's Matteo, who was just convicted of fraud. Mount Real organization. Anyway, they fronted this men's lifestyle, but I was still writing for this magazine. Right? Anyway, I did a lot of stuff like that, but at the same time, in parallel with that, I started studying what people were doing that were making their living online. And I discovered that, okay, number one, you have to find a niche that you're interested in, a niche that involves something you're good at, and also that people are interested in, okay? People will be looking for information in this, okay? So once I realized that, and I realized that squash wasn't going to cut it because I was a squash
player. Yeah, we need to get onto that, but we'll do that later.
I actually flirted with the idea, but
Yeah.
I thought, that was dumb actually, because I love squash, but I'm not a squash pro or an expert or anything. So anyway, I finally settled on writing help, okay, practical writing help for the average person, okay, because I'm very good at just simplifying things in writing, okay. I don't write in academic style, I write in straight, plain, spoken English. And that's always been one of my fortes. So I started up this fledgling website called writinghelpcentral.com. I could go off on a whole tangent here about Ken Evoy and SiteCell, but anyway, it was hosted by SiteCell. by one of the true internet small business pioneers, Ken Evoy, Dr. MD from Montreal, who still hosts thousands of small entrepreneurs around the world.
Talk a little bit about that, because that's news to me. I don't know about that.
Dr.
That
Ken
Montreal,
Evoy, well,
yeah.
he doesn't live in Montreal anymore, but
He did. He started
yes,
in
he was
Montreal.
trained at McGill, and he was an emergency medicine doctor. Anyway, oh God, that's another long story. But anyway, it just so happened around the time that I thought that I want to go online, there was an article ran in the Gazette, Montreal Gazette, about this Ken Evoy and this company called SiteCell. And now it was probably Ken Evoy to push to get the article in or whatever, but he had started. He was a very entrepreneurial guy. He and his wife had already made a fortune, even though he was a medical doctor, emergency medicine doctor. He and his wife had invented these toys. You know, what are they called? You know, these cute backpack toys that convert into backpacks, things.
Yeah.
Anyway, they made a fortune on these and sold the copyright to them and everything to big companies and everything. So he was already a millionaire. Then he started dabbling online, and he wrote a piece or designed a piece of software that he had coders write. He became a millionaire, an online entrepreneur. But during that time, he learned how to, and this is back in the late 90s, excuse me, how to make a living online and how to be successful online in those days. So he wrote a book about that, which sold thousands of copies worldwide. Then he set up a company called SiteCell, which essentially was this a hosting company. You know, where if I'm a person who wants to start a business online, I host my website with SiteCell. But this thing was a total turnkey. It offered every kind of service you would want. You know, from you know, a newsletter service, a list management service, whatever services you need to run a business online, he packaged them all together in this company called SiteCell.com. Anyway, long story short, I bought into this right away. My first website was a SiteCell website. What I did was I started writing content in my niche. And once you have people coming to your website, you can study statistics and see what people are actually looking for when they come there. And so after a couple of years, I was getting a lot of, approaching 1 million visitors a year, that sort of thing. And I could study what people were. So I started to write how-to books related to what people were looking for. Now, who knew? I didn't know that. It turned out that when I looked at my stats, that thousands of people were coming to my website looking for information how to write recommendation letters and reference letters. Okay, I wouldn't have known this. So I wrote a book, which is actually still available, called Instant Recommendation Letter Kit: How to Write Winning Letters of Recommendation. It, in effect, became the de facto Bible on writing recommendation letters and reference letters for all situations. And over the years, I've published 4 or 5 editions of that. Okay, I just kept adding to it, expanding it. And so anyway, so I had this website. This website became sort of my mothership website that started over the years attracting millions of visitors per year. At one point,
wow.
At one point in the around 2010, it was up to around 12 or 13 million visitors a year. Okay, free. This is free traffic. Okay. So essentially, in parallel with that, over the years, whenever I found like a recommendation letter kit, I wrote a book on that. So I set up a separate website for that product, and people would go to that website. A certain small percentage of people would go to that website. They would click from my recommendation letter pages, go to that website, and download the book, download it, so I would get paid that way. So anyway, long story short, over the years, I wrote about 12 or 15 of these how-to books. And so I had a network, in the end I had a network of about 15 websites. This mothership site and then these satellite sites selling these different
Did you have a publishing company name, or what were you?
Final Draft Publishing.
Final Draft,
yeah, that
okay.
was my local name. In other words, I self-published. Okay?
Yeah, you were on the forefront. And they were in what format that people got the books?
Well, the people, if they downloaded from my website,
Yeah.
they would download a PDF book. But the other thing about my thing, if it involved any kind of document or letters or anything, they would get a separate MS Word file with all of those documents, an MS Word form they could load into the word processor and work with, okay? So they didn't ever have to start from scratch, okay? They could just...
So a template.
They would get templates. They would get all the templates that came in the product. So they would get the PDF book and the template.
So you had 15 different websites.
Yes.
You,
Well, 14 to be exact.
Oh, well, 14. And all of these would have their separate, unique visitors up to a
Well,
point.
essentially, the way the model worked is that writinghelpcentral.com is where I would publish all of my content. So I had 400 or 500 pages on there of articles, like hundreds of thousands of words, like articles on how to write business letters, how to write recommendation letters, how to write CVs, how to write anything. I even ended up writing a book, how to write how-to books. Okay? Actually, it sold quite well, too. Yeah, because I had learned how to do this, so I made it so right. Yeah, you know, the proof is in the pudding, right? Put up or shut up. Anyway, so I had the...
Okay, we've got all the websites, we've got all this traffic,
Right.
but because of that, you were in on that early, you could have ads or things like that.
Well, yeah, essentially, okay, so I was selling I was telling you the way the model worked.
Yeah.
People would be attracted to the main website based on the keyword searches. So if someone was looking for a business letter, how to write a business letter, there's a good chance in the Google results, somewhere in the top 10 or 20, there would be a link to my Writing Help Central site. They would come to the article on how to write business letters on my Writing Help Central site. It would be a good article, quality content, telling them exactly what to do and how to do it. But there would also be ads from me, just text ads saying, just subtle text ads if you wanted more about, more info about writing business letters or whatever. Click on this link, and that would take them to my website that sold them my book on instant book business letter kit, okay? Or instant resignation letter kit, or whatever over the years. So that was my model. The other part of my model that generated a lot of income was these pages also had Google ads on them, okay? And people would click on Google ads, and I would get paid for those clicks.
Yeah, and this was at the time before Google had refined its algorithms or wherever. So you got all this millions of traffic, international from around the world, and everything. Right. So so financially, you did pretty well out of this.
Yeah, well, once I got to a certain level around 2005 to 2012, traffic was building every year. Google Ads was paying well. My products were selling well, so I was doing very well for a 5 or 6 year period, very well. But as you and I discussed the other day, I don't know if you recall, back around mid-2005 or so, between 2005 and 2010, you would do some Google searches and you would get a lot of garbage coming up. You would, whatever your keywords, and you get a lot of junk, okay? And you'd have to sift through all this junk. And anyway, what happened is that there were thousands of people around the world had figured out how to game the Google search algorithms. So they would just put up garbage content riddled with keywords, and it would trick the Google search algorithm. Traffic would go to their website, and they would have Google ads there, and they get paid. So a lot of these people were getting paid tens of thousands of dollars a year for junk. But it was hurting everybody, right? So what happened is this became known, articles got written about it, New York Times, everywhere else, and Google had to clean up their act, okay, and get rid of these bad boys. And so actually, about 2010, 2011, they made a major adjustment to their search algorithm, which is a secret algorithm with many, many variables, which determines how sites get ranked when a search is done. It was called the Penguin shake-up. The Penguin, the Penguin model, whatever it was called. It was called Penguin anyway, and it was this massive adjustment to their search algorithm. And what it meant is that it weeded out a lot of those junk artists, but it also hurt people like me because
you were giving quality product, but you got hurt into the business.
Well, I became collateral damage in the sense that over the years, I had written many articles online, and many of these articles were listed on online article directories, and there were dozens and dozens of article directories. Well, it turns out that Google did not like these article directories because essentially they were just lists of other people's articles. So basically they wiped out all these article directories. So all the traffic I was getting from my link in these articles disappeared like pretty well overnight. Okay, so in about 1 year, over about a 1 year period, my traffic, went from like 10 or 12 million a year down to 3 or 4 million a year. And then it eventually leveled off a couple of years later because there was another adjustment after Penguin, and it was Penguin 1, 2, 3 and stuff like that. There was a thing called Panda, which was a kind of a final adjustment. And so I ended up, a year ago, when I sold my website, my traffic levels were about 2 million. Okay?
Wow.
Which was still a lot of traffic,
but
that had been 10 or 12.
10 or 12 million.
And
yeah.
so that had a direct, just a direct impact on my income, okay, that I was making from my websites. So, yeah, so I had a number of years that were very good. Starting in 2011, 2012, things leveled off. And also, I had reached the point where there was nothing more I could do in my niche or I was interested in doing. I'd written all the how-to books I wanted to. And so I started thinking, at some point I want to maybe sell this or do something with my websites. And as it turned out, a year ago, I did sell all of my online properties.
And how did that come about?
It came about by me deciding it was time to sell. But one of the underlying reasons why is the year before. Now this is the beginnings of what I'm into now, the furniture making business. Okay, the totally unrelated furniture making business. Anyway, the year before, my daughter, who also lives in Griffintown, she had moved into her new condo in phase 10 of the Lowney project. And we were shopping for a coffee table. She wanted to buy a coffee table, and we were in these high-end furniture stores that they've now situated.
Opened in Griffintown, yeah.
It just so happens one we were in no longer exists, but anyway, it was a nice one. And she saw this table there, and she said, "Oh, Dad, I love that one." And I looked at it, and I saw that it was a steel frame, and it appeared to be recycled wood. And I blurted it, "Oh, I could make you one of those." Well, yeah. Right.
Famous last words.
Exactly, because I live in the 9th floor of a condo building. I don't have a workshop. I haven't, anyway. So, but once I commit myself, that's it. So it just so happened at that time I was on the condo board of my building, condo building. So I had access to an electrical room downstairs. So I asked permission from my colleagues if I could use this for a couple of weeks. And I went out along the St. Patrick's industrial lots along Rue St. Patrick there, along the Machine Canal. Collected old pallets, old pieces of industrial, recycled industrial wood just lying around, etc. And I did a drawing based on this table we had seen, and I found a welder, and I gave him my drawing, and I got him to weld the frame, and then I assembled the whole thing by hand in this room. And my daughter still has it in her living room. She loves this table, and everybody who saw it loved this table. And I thought, so that's in the back of my mind, okay, I'm thinking, okay, I'm working with recycled wood here, industrial recycled wood. Some of it is pallet wood, industrial steel I'm using. And the whole Griffintown connection is starting to come to me, okay, because as I said, I'd already been interested in history. And so anyway, this percolated for about a year, where I didn't really do much more, but a year later I decided, okay, I really liked working with those materials. I'm going to do another version of my daughter's table, except this time I'm going to try to improve my method, okay, my method of construction, etc. So by this time, I didn't even have access anymore to the electrical room in my building because I had resigned from the condo board. So, but I decided I was going to do it, so I did a drawing. I went to a welder because I didn't have any access to welding equipment at the time. And I ended up, I don't know what I was thinking at the time actually, because I ended up, you know, using the, for my workspace, you have these lockers, storage lockers in condo buildings. Well, outside my storage locker, okay? So people would come in and go to their locker, and I'd be there with all my tools and my stuff and whatever. Anyway, I made this second table, and I thought, okay, this is a prototype now. And during the time I was making the second table, I was just back and forth by email with a friend who lives near Ottawa, Canada, and I've known a guy I've known all my life, and he said, well, I said, geez, you know, if only I had a place to work, if I only had access to tools, etc., etc., and he said, well, he happened to know that one of these new makerspaces had just opened in Montreal, and so he sent me a link, and I checked it out, and sure enough, in St. Henry, what's called a makerspace had opened. It was called Helios Makerspace. Don't ask me why Helios. It's never become clear why it's called Helios.
It's a Greek god.
I know, but why it's related to the makerspace, I don't know. But anyway, turns out I didn't know at the time that there's an international movement of these makerspaces in urban areas, so that people who don't have access to tools and expertise can come and share information with other people who don't have access to tools. Long story short, I bought sort of a part-time membership there, not a 24/7 membership initially, but it's totally volunteer run, so they're only actually open on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and volunteers come in to manage it. But anyway, long story short, that gave me enough access so that I decided, okay, I like this idea of building this furniture, but I'd like to just, you know, maybe build some furniture like this for people, but I have to get the word out that I'm doing this, and they have to see what I can do. And so I thought, okay, so I spent a year going into this makerspace and making prototypes, okay? So like coffee tables, bedside tables, bookshelves, kitchen islands, you know, one of each, okay? Serving trays, wine racks. In the end, I now have about 20 different unique prototypes, okay, that I've done using these two materials.
And where do you store them all?
Well, I store them in Griffintown. Actually, the main railway tracks that run to the Gare Centrale there,
yeah,
the passenger trains go on.
Yeah.
Right underneath those railway tracks is a depotium
That's
storage.
right. Yes.
Well, so they're probably within 100 meters of where I live. Okay, I look out and I see the depotium there, and I have a storage area in there. But I knew it was important that I have a website, okay, because of my experience online and everything, and also just, you know, my background is in marketing as well when I did my MBA. And I knew it was going to have to look professional. So what I did was I made all of these prototypes, stored them away as I did them, and then last summer I did some searching around, and I found a woman who lives in Point St. Charles, who has a full-time job as a designer. So on the side, she became my creative director, and I hired her to manage a photo shoot and create the look and feel of my website, okay?
It's a fabulous website, because when I first sort of got a mailing from you,
okay,
I went to the website to find out what the heck it was about, and I was blown away. And one of the things that really impressed me was you had a whole history of Griffintown there. which I thought it was very clear, but it was also over and above what you normally would find on a commercial website that's selling something. You actually provided additional value to, especially I would think, to the young people moving into Griffintown. They really don't know the history of the area they're moving into, and it was like the 19th century industrial hub of Montreal.
Of Canada.
And of Canada, yeah, because everything was loaded onto the railways, or, you know, the Lachine Canal, which was right there, and it would, you know, go down the Grand Trunk, and which became CN. Right. So it's really part of what Montreal is, and also this particular project, it's heart and central. But anyway, as I said, I was blown away by your website, and then I got in touch and said...
Well, that's great, because that's exactly the reaction I was hoping to get from people.
Well, I wanted to tell you it was very good, and I wanted to say, I didn't know if you did it yourself. I didn't know the story about the lady who helped you, but it's a really first-rate website.
I supervised the whole thing, but I knew I wanted a professional, consistent look and feel. So, for example, if you look at any of the photographs of the pieces of furniture, they all have like a industrial brick wall in the background, okay? Well, that's just special wallpaper stuck to a wall in my storage, my commercial storage unit. And I just never took it down since then. And so now when I do a new project, I take it in there and photograph it.
It's wonderful. I thought it was.
No, it's very. That's why I got it. I went to the design show last spring, and there's a company that sells these incredible murals that are taken with ultra high definition cameras over time lapse. So you have to go over to touch this to know that it's not actual brick.
Wow.
Okay? These photographs are so good. So,
well, it's very effective on the website.
Yeah, so anyway, so that's how the website got created. And of course, I also had the idea of the coin. That came to me long before. I've been reading a woodworking book, okay? Oh, well, I noticed that some woodworkers, like I subscribe to a woodworking magazine, and I've been checking out websites and things, and a lot of them use these branding things that they burn their their logo, whatever, into the wood. But then I saw this one article, and a guy was actually embedding coins, and I thought, wow, that's classy. And so I thought, wow, this would be perfect for Griffintown if I could get a kind of an antique-y, authentic kind of look and feel. And so I worked with an artist who I met at Makerspace, and we co-designed this coin. The Griffinworks coin, it says Griffinworks Montreal, but the G, you see the three heavy lines that make up the GW? Okay, those stand for the three major elements used in the development of Griffintown: railways, waterways, meaning Lachine Canal, St. Lawrence Seaway, its connection, and industries. And the two-tone effect represents the two elements that I use, wood and steel. Okay, so the coin actually has meaning, and it does have a kind of authentic, antique industrial.
Yes, it's very effective. It's very effective, and you embed this in each of your pieces, so it's almost like your signature.
Yes, as a matter of fact, yesterday I actually did one, just embedded one in a slab piece that I'm making for somebody for a lift-top desk. One of these automatic. They bought the base that lifts up electronically. While I did the slab for it.
And what kind of wood did you use?
It's a slab he bought. It's not recycled. It's American ash. Beautiful piece of wood. It was nice working with it. But it has a nice Griffinworks coin embedded in it down in one corner.
Did you design it, or did
well, I co-designed it. I met an artist. Just chatting with. This is the thing about a makerspace. All these creative people come in there with all different backgrounds, and you get chatting with them, and some are woodworkers, some are painters, some are sculptors, some are photographers. Anyway, I got tired talking to this woman. She was a graphic artist, And you know, and at one point when I thought, oh, I do need this coin, I said, would you be interested? And so we met and talked about it, and she came up with the concept, and then we worked on the concept, and then finally came up with this.
So who makes them for you?
There's an engraving company right in Phillips Square.
Oh, I know it, yes.
Renault.
Yeah, it's been there forever.
Renault, yeah,
Yes,
forever.
it's been
Yeah, but anyway, he shipped it out to one of his contractors. I don't even know who actually, but they did a beautiful job.
Yeah,
It's
no,
very
it's gorgeous.
precise, and look, it even says Canada under here in very small print.
No,
Yeah.
it's a lovely. They do lovely work. In my career, I use them an awful lot for presentation pieces and
the
things
reason
like
I
that.
knew about them was when I was at IMT, that training institute, we would give out all these awards and certificates and plaques and things, and we had them all done there.
Exactly. Well, I was at IATA, so
Oh.
we did exactly the same.
Yeah, actually, you go in there and see the IATA things. Yeah.
Yeah, I did IATA, and prior to that, I was at KLM,
Okay.
and it was the same thing.
Okay.
I went there to get
Yeah.
all the things we needed.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got to the point where you've got your signature stamp, you've got your place where you can make it. I actually looked up Makerspace, and I'd never heard of them before, but it's quite a fabulous concept, and I think the St. Henry Makerspace is one of the first in Canada, or was, I'm not 100% sure, but I couldn't find.
But it's not the first in the world. I think
No,
I
it's
think
an
this one
international.
started in Europe.
Yeah, no, it's an international concept, but I tried to find them in other places
Yeah.
across Canada, and I didn't
Okay.
find
Okay.
anything on Google, but maybe.
No, I haven't really researched them. I just from talking to the co-founders of the one in Montreal, they told me that the best one they know of in North America is in Boston.
Yeah, I found some in the States, but I
Yeah.
didn't find any other one in Canada. So
Okay.
I'm not saying it's definitive.
Actually, Ottawa has one, but it may not be actually officially a makerspace, but they have the same concept. a
It's the same
community
concept,
workshop.
yeah.
Workshop, yeah.
So you've got your.
So anyway, so what that led to is once I had that furniture thing kind of going as a hobby in the background based on the table for my daughter, and then decided to do prototypes, then I really decided I didn't want to do the writing thing anymore. I was still posting an article every month. I had built up a list of 35 or 40,000 people around the world. Every month I would send them an article and things. But I decided, well, it's time to end all this. So I contacted somebody who I had run across in the same niche as me, who just so happens to live in Chatham, Ontario. And she had online training business and online editorial services business. I just wrote her a letter and said, look, I've built this network of websites over the years. I've got all this traffic. I've got this list of 35, 40,000 people. Would you be interested? Well, along back and forth, emails, et cetera, and as of last April 30th, she owned all of my online properties.
Yeah, and what I understand about that is that, in fact, sometime previously, she'd contacted you
Yes.
to put some of her ads on,
Exactly.
and you hadn't been
That's how I
interested.
became aware of her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then when you had this idea that maybe you wanted to divest of your
Online
properties,
yes.
you got in touch with
Yes.
her. But the other interesting fact about that is that you never actually met face to face.
No.
You did it all, a new way of doing business.
We never even spoke on the phone.
You did? Oh my
I think
goodness.
that's better.
It was completely by email.
And then the other interesting fact is that you used another online service to actually conduct the transaction.
This for anybody selling an online property, I'd recommend this highly because usually you don't know who you're dealing with. They're in a different country, whatever. There are these companies, but there's one in particular called escrow.com. Essentially, you and the person that you're selling to or buying from, you reach your own agreement separately. Once you've kind of agreed on your terms, and it's going to be an exchange of money soon, money for material, you both go through this escrow company, and they hold the money. And both parties have to say, yes, I'm happy on my end, I'm happy on your end, before they release the money. And it works very, very well, and the fee is amazingly low.
Yeah, you told me it was.
It's like a couple $100.
Yeah, it was really quite amazing for that kind of level of safety or security. Yeah, that's
and
quite.
Apparently, they do $1 million deals all the time.
Something that I just wanted to clarify, because this project is based in the Atwater Library,
right.
And one of the things we like to ask, because it's if people have actually come into the Atwater Library or knew of it, and I believe you did, because in your publishing where you were a member of the Quebec Writers Federation, which rents in this building.
I initially became a member of AELAQ, the English language publishers of Quebec, basically from when I wrote my first how-to book. I somehow became aware of AELAQ. So around 2001, 2002, I became a member of them, and then about 5 years ago, I guess, I became a member of QWF. They're both headquartered here, and so I would come in here, into this room actually often, for the meetings of AELAQ, for example.
And that's why I thought it'd be nice to have the interview here, because it's kind of connecting different parts of your life. No, because it's quite surprising the number of people that we've interviewed that have walked past the doors of the Atwater Library and never actually came in.
And over the years, I occasionally did use the library for reference purposes.
I used it for computer lessons, so.
Okay.
I did the computer center part rather than the library part. Now, if we kind of go back to some other parts of your life, we've covered pretty extensively your career and your working. I want to pick up on a couple of things. There are a few more personal questions.
Okay.
You mentioned you were almost a lifelong fan of Leonard Cohen, and that you made trips with your friend from Ottawa to Montreal. But there's a more recent connection. There's a marvelous exhibition at the Montreal Museum of Modern Art, known by its French acronym MAC, or the Musée d'Art Contemporain, and it opened just after the first anniversary of Leonard Cohen's death. There's an exhibition entitled Leonard Cohen, A Crack in Everything. And what's interesting about this is that a number of different artists from all over the world were asked to set up different installations. And you are a participant in one of those installations by, just let me get her name correctly, she's a South African artist. She works out of her studio is in Berlin, and her name is Candice Breitz.
Candice Breitz.
Breitz, sorry about that. And how did you get to be involved in this?
Well, about 1 year ago, now Leonard had died 3 or 4 months prior to that. I had been a lifelong follower and fan of Leonard's, and so I was plugged into a couple of on Facebook. Leonard Cohen. There's a chap who has a website that.
Cohen-centric?
Yeah, exactly.
Cohen-centric, yes.
This Showalter, his name is Showalter, David Showalter.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's constantly. Anyway, I was plugged into that, and I was plugged into a couple of other things. And anyway, about a year ago, announcements started coming out that an artist was looking for men over 60, mid-60s, whatever, who were lifelong fans of Leonard Cohen, because she was planning some sort of exhibition. Okay, at that time it wasn't really clear what this was about. I ignored it a few times, and then finally one day I clicked on it, started to read what is this about, and it said, well, it's going to involve singing. So I really said no, because I'm not a singer. But anyway, another call went out. I looked again, and I read, and they had a detailed description of what this was about and what would be required. And it actually, by that time, they said, look, we want you as a lifelong Leonard Cohen fan, male in your mid-60s, to come into our video studio, and we want you to sing the entire album, I'm Your Man, in front of a video camera with the audio turned on. And I thought, oh my God, this is crazy. However,
it's crazy mad, but however, I'm interested.
Well, it intrigued me for a couple of reasons. Well, number one, just I knew this is a once in a lifetime thing. Also, it just so happened that my sister Ellen, who is now deceased, she died in 1996 of breast cancer in her mid-40s. But she was an artist and a performance artist and a huge Leonard Cohen fan, okay? So actually I felt that Ellen was guiding me to even do this, to get into this, okay? So so my performance, my part of this is dedicated to my sister Ellen. So I guess that's the thing that really swung it for me. So I filled out this long, detailed questionnaire, and me being a writer and talky, as you can see, I filled out this long questionnaire, and I didn't think anything of it. And then we were supposed to hear by the end of April, and I totally forgot. In the first week of May last year, I get this email saying, Candice Breese has selected you as one of the 18 men. So are you still interested? Will you do it? And I said, yes, I'm in. So anyway, what it meant was that as one of the 18 men chosen for this installation that Candice was doing, I had to go into the Phi Center in Old Montreal on June 3rd, and you know, after green room prep and all of that, essentially I stood in front of a red velvet curtain behind me, and with special earphones where I could hear Leonard singing the album. I had to sing through the entire album, okay? And we weren't allowed lyric sheets, okay? So we had to know the lyrics or have them somewhat memorized. So I'd done a lot of practicing at home, okay?
In your bathroom?
No, in my living room.
Oh, okay. I'm so glad you had concrete walls then.
Yeah, well, so with headphones in my living room and just singing along so that I knew when I did if you go to the installation, go. It's very, after you read the New York Times article.
No, actually, I will read a paragraph for it because it will explain it.
Okay.
And I thought it was a perfect description of it. The reverence for Cohen reaches a crescendo at the museum in an alluring multi-channel video installation by South African artist Candice Breese, in which 18 older men are simultaneously singing, in some cases croaking, the words of the entire comeback album, I'm Your Man, accompanied by the Shah Hashemayim Synagogue's choir. They just say the synagogue's choir, but we know it's the Shah Hashemayim. As the individually recorded men's voices merge and the men dance, sway, or tear up, the reflection on aging and masculinity, as well as super fandom, is both comical and moving. And I have to say, it really is. It's a fabulous installation.
Did you go?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
At the time, I didn't know I was looking at you, or that I'd be interviewing you, and I'm about to go back with another friend, because it's actually an exhibition you need to go back several times. It's just, it's mind blowing.
I'm going back at least twice.
Yeah, and you got to do it before. Yeah, you got to do it before
April 9th.
April 9th. I think it was extended by 1 week. It used to be April 1st. It used to be April 1st.
April 9th for a long time.
Yeah, but I think originally all the initial ads said April 1st, and then it started April 9th. But anyway, that's beside the point. So, so I now know one of my questions had been, how did you get to participate? And you explained that. How was it? How was the whole experience for you?
Well, it was exhausting, actually.
Oh, I can imagine.
Well, also, being a bit of a hyper-perfectionist, I I didn't want to make a total idiot of myself, so I did practice at home for about 2 weeks whenever I had the chance. To the point where I could do most of the album just listening to Leonard without the lyric sheets, without having to refer. But some of the lyrics are very difficult. They're beautiful lyrics, but they don't just necessarily flow naturally. Some of the images, so they're hard songs to memorize. But once I got in there, she's an amazing person.
I don't
she
know.
really is. She's in her mid-40s. She's just this total creative force. And so she was just wonderful. She was like very hands-on with each guy, because each guy was shot separately. So the day I was shot, there were just 3 of us shot that day. Okay, so she shot over 6 or 7 days to get the 18 guys. And then she, she's a hyper-perfectionist, I can tell you. And anyway, she wanted everything just such and such a way. And then even after the 42 minutes of singing, whatever, without a break, by the way, she wanted also to do an interview, which she also filmed, but it's not part of the exhibition. But for her archives, whatever. And also, she actually, part of the interview with me, she used in one of her promos. If you click from
I saw that. I saw it.
Yeah, that was taken from the after-shoot interview.
Okay.
Which she did with everybody, an after-shoot interview. But anyway, it was a fascinating experience. It was like a professional video shoot. Presumably, they had professional technicians there, the whole deal. Candace managed it very well. She had a couple of people working with her, and did the post-shoot interview, and it was exhausting. But
and later on, what was it actually like to see yourself, like actually go and view yourself as part of a museum installation?
The whole week of the opening, there were so many events going on, because first of all, Jenny Holzer, her installation, which was words projected on the silos in the Old Port.
Yeah.
Now, there was a big event on the Monday of that week. Then there were a number of press events. Then there were, the 18 guys had never met. So Candace and her assistant arranged for us all to meet at a bar in Old Montreal, right across from the Phi Center.
Which one?
Pub Saint, right across Pub Saint Gabriel, is it? Right across the street from the Phi Center.
Yeah.
Right, there's a pub there. And so we met there for the first time, and Candace was there, and that was special. And then the day of, a couple of days later, was the walkthrough, the private walkthrough for the press. And so a number of the 18 guys went on that with Candace. And then there was the day of the true opening, the public opening. And Candace, that was exciting because Candace the room was packed. But Candace got all 18 guys to sing, trying to get everybody in the room, including the 18 guys, but all viewers, to sing the whole album, I'm Your Man, through one song. And she got us to do it.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
and the organizers put up with it.
Well, they loved it. They loved it. Zepparelli and the co-assistant curator, they just loved the whole thing. And they're loving this thing. I think it's the biggest thing they've ever done.
Yeah, it's the biggest. It's really quite...
It's generating, I'm sure, a lot of income, and it's...
Yeah, and their other sort of huge exhibit was when they were in their other space down at the Cité du Havre.
Okay.
And they did the most amazing Judy Chicago exhibit called the Dinner Table. And it was, to me, that was like, I still get goosebumps about that exhibit. But I have to say the Leonard Cohen one is pretty good too.
Yeah. But Candace had done a number, first of all, Candace is one of 20 artists, or 20 installations. There are actually 40 artists involved if you count all the musicians, okay? There are about 10 or 15 musicians involved in one installation. But there are 20 installations, But Candace had already done a similar concept years ago for John Lennon and also for Bob Marley.
Oh, okay.
Okay, where she did have fans singing on screens, okay? Of course, technology has improved, etc. So
Right.
these are like life-size vertical screens now.
Yeah.
And as you know, when you walk in, have you been
No,
to
I
this?
haven't been,
Well,
no.
when you walk into this round,
Maybe I should go.
you walk
to
into
go.
this round room and you're just surrounded by these 18 men with about maybe 4 to 5 feet between their screens, all at the same time in unison singing the songs from I'm Your Man.
It's,
So
it's quite impressive. It's quite impressive. And they're all wearing different.
Well, we're just we're told
You
to show up
Yeah.
with whatever we want
Whatever
to
you,
wear.
Yeah.
I wore a turtleneck and a jacket because Leonard
Yeah.
Cohen was often seen in that. Well, a number of guys wore hats because he wore a fedora.
Yeah, with a fedora.
Not so
yeah.
much, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, it was quite an experience.
Yes, I went to the tribute concert at the Bell
Well,
Centre, which I
and
believe
yes,
you were
I was
there,
there with my
and I was
daughter.
amazed about the number of men that came wearing trills.
Yeah.
It was
Well,
quite something.
It turned out, I didn't know that, okay, I wasn't as much of a, even though I'd been a Cohen fan when I was 17, I discovered a couple of guys, one guy in particular from Ottawa called Don Cummer, who always wears a fedora, and he posts incessantly to Facebook about everything. He has belonged to an international organization of Cohen appreciators. They would actually go and meet all over the world at
Yeah.
wherever he was having
It's
a
a
concert.
Cohen fan club.
I never got into it to that degree. But
Yeah. No, it's they're such a well-organized organization that they even get special rates for the different
Oh.
shows. So because they can guarantee X amount of
Guarantee a
people.
number of people, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, we've spoken about your public life and your amazing career journey. We didn't touch too much on your early construction work. You kind of very mentioned it because one of the things that had happened, you said, you sold to somebody from Chatham, Ontario, but the reason Chatham sort of rang a bell with you was that you'd had an accident there early on.
You remember everything.
And you hurt your back. Could you speak
Okay.
just briefly?
Well, okay, when I contacted, this woman that had contacted me about
Exactly.
putting ads on my website, who I ultimately sold my web properties to, when I went and checked her out in the first place a couple of years ago, checked out her website and everything, I discovered she was based in Chatham, Ontario. And the moment I saw that, I said, oh, well, this is a message from the universe, because out of all the places in the world she could have been from, it didn't even have to be in Canada, right? She could have been from anywhere with
Yeah,
visiting
yeah,
business.
yeah.
She was in Chatham, Ontario, and it just so happened the summer I was 18, I was working for a construction company. We were building a bridge over the Sydenham River, within 20, 30 miles of Chatham, Ontario, and that summer I broke my back. The construction crane was lifting a big section of forms over us. We were down the excavation, the wire broke, and so I ended up in the hospital in Chatham for 10 days of my life, okay? And I could have been killed in that accident.
Absolutely.
Okay, often I've thought over the years I could have been killed. I wasn't. Anyway, so that was my
And you
connection
weren't,
to
you
Chatham.
obviously didn't lose, when you say break your back,
It was
was
a
it just?
compression fracture, so I
Okay.
didn't, there was no nerve damage, thank God.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So we've had your beginning in construction and shop and things like that, and then you had a pretty exciting and commendable public service career when you really think about it, and then the transition in your 40s to your entrepreneurial side, and you did your freelance consulting, and then life as an internet commerce pioneer and writer and author and everything, and then right up to the present day where you've almost come full circle and you've gone back to working with your hands and with your designing of your furniture, and you're also combined your MBA because you've got to sell the stuff and market it, so you're using your skills, and so this is a bit more personal, which is...
Before you go, I know where you're going, But just before that, while you're still on the career thing, it is related. It just so happens that this week I signed a contract with a company called Aviation Strategies International, which is run by the guy who drew me to St. John's for the project team, who also drew me to help with that International Institute. He runs Aviation Strategies International. They are...
And what's his name?
Pierre Coutu.
Pierre
Coutu, he's from Montreal. He does international aviation. Yeah.
So he's drawing you back into that world again.
Yes, and the reason he's drawing me back in, he talked to me about a year ago about coming in as a general consultant. I didn't want to do that anymore. But it just so happens his company has decided they are going to produce a major publication book on the subject of megatrends in aviation and how to handle them. And so they've hired me to be editor-in-chief of that.
Wow, so you're being drawn back into the publishing world.
So I get to do that in parallel with the furniture now.
Wow,
you're
just going to stay, you don't stop. So,
but you were going somewhere else.
I was trying to sum up your amazing career. You know, as I said, you're very much the Renaissance man, but there's always a positive side to life, and then there's some of the negative things or less challenging things that we face in life. And I believe that at a certain period in your life you had an alcohol dependency. And I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about that, just to sort of round out that you didn't have the perfect life, in a way.
Far from perfect.
Far from.
Alcohol or no alcohol, far from perfect. But anyway, no, you're right, because that was an important event in my life, getting sober. Because, I grew up in a family where, my dad would come home from work, he and my mom would have a drink together, while mom, the 1950s situation comedies, mom would be all dressed up with their makeup on, pour dad a drink, they'd have a drink together, chat, whatever. And alcohol was just part of winding down at the end of the day, okay? So, as a teenager, we used to party on weekends and stuff, nothing unusual about that. Then, but I would say by the time I was in my 20s, I was a daily drinker, okay? Now, I didn't get drunk a lot, but alcohol was in my system almost every single day. And a lot of people do that, big deal. But the thing is, I got to the point in my life, in I'd say my mid-30s, where I was starting to use alcohol to deal with life, okay? To change the way I felt, to deal with, also alcohol is a depressant, okay? And I found myself becoming depressed, okay? And I didn't know alcohol was a depressant. In fact, I would drink to deal with the depression, but of course you get into a cycle because you become more depressed and you don't know what the alcohol is doing it. Anyway, long story short, by the time I was in my late 30s, around 38, I realized that I could not drink. Okay, I had never tried to stop drinking. Now, if you never try to stop, then you don't know you have a problem because you never tried to stop. So, but whatever. But I came to a point in my life where a couple of things happened related to personal relationships. Actually, a woman from Montreal was actually the one that sort of blew the whistle. A woman I was seeing in Montreal. She asked me one time if there was a problem with alcohol. That was the first time I'd ever faced it. And so a few weeks later, I ended up checking myself into rehab at the Royal Ottawa Hospital in 1988. A few weeks later, I went into that program, and they had a detox, and then followed by a 28-day program. And so August 10th, 1988 was when I had my last drink of alcohol. So that
30 years, almost 30 years.
Yeah, almost 30 years. So that did have a big impact on my life in the sense that I've never been depressed since. Exercise has become an important part of my life, you know, like a much more balanced, healthier lifestyle and everything. My IQ went up for sure, you know, the ability to concentrate, the ability to focus, the ability to analyze, etc.
You mentioned a number at some point when you stopped drinking, your IQ.
Oh, 5 to 10 points, somewhere in there, I'm sure.
Okay. And you also felt that your unhappy marriage had something to do with that?
Well, okay. First of all, it was in my family, okay? On my mother's, family secrets, right? Okay? I grew up in a family where, I remember when I was 13 years old, we were living in Nova Scotia, Ontario, because Uncle Fred had suddenly died. You know, talking, whispering and everything, and she comes back, and Uncle Fred died, whatever. We don't really know what exactly happened. And then a couple of years later, the same thing with Uncle Ken. He died suddenly, and you know, all the whispering and everything. We never know what happened, except he died suddenly. It was only actually when I came into recovery myself that I actually learned the full story from my mother and her sister. Actually, I pumped her sister for information because her sister was more forthcoming. Her sister in Barrie, Ontario. That both of my uncles died in the early 40s. They were both alcoholics. They were fighting alcohol. One went to Toronto checked himself into a hotel and blew his brains out. Uncle Fred, at the age of 44. The other, Uncle Ken, after an all-night binge, whatever, choked to death in his own vomit. And it turns out my mother's father was a heavy-duty alcoholic. Although he was a pillar of the community, successful guy in Midland, Ontario, ran the local insurance agency. He was a heavy drinker, heavy cigar smoker, and he died of esophageal cancer, which is generally heavily related to alcoholism at the age of 59. So all this stuff was kept hidden from me as I grew up. But not that it would have made a difference to me intellectually.
No.
But it meant that I probably was predisposed, if I ever started drinking alcohol to deal with life, I would go the same way. And that's what was happening. So by the grace of God, and through this recovery, Royal Ottawa Hospital and the 28-day program at Meadow Creek and AA, I've been sober ever since, one day at a time.
You make it sound in some ways so simple, and I know it's not. But you said it just took a lady friend to say, do you have a problem with alcohol? Whereas...
Well, that was the moment.
Yeah, I sort of have family issues with alcohol, with people in my family, plus friends.
Right.
And most of them are in total denial. Like alcohol is not something they have a problem with. So what was it about your friend that it struck a chord that you actually went almost straight away and did something about it?
Well, no, it was just, I think it was just, she was the first person who had ever confronted me with it. Because I was very good at hiding it, and I had a high capacity. I was still functional, at work and everything. I hadn't lost my job, all of this. As a matter of fact, in a way, around that time, alcohol helped me because it was my only coping mechanism. It helped me leave that second marriage because I had to leave that marriage for my own sanity, okay? Alcohol or not, but the alcohol actually helped me get through that somehow. And it was actually a year after I left that marriage that I checked myself into rehab, okay? So, no, it was just, that woman, she confronted me with it that day in a way that, nobody had ever before. And I knew she was right.
I stopped filming this when you said keep it confidential. So do you want to start again? The part that you said, you when you said to us, that,
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to keep anything, no?
well, I wasn't happy with leaving it going when you were said that. And
Oh, you didn't?
so there's part of that, there's a little bit missing there, yeah.
Oh,
It's okay.
okay.
I think it's better not to be there, yes.
Why?
I think that what I've got is saying what you wanted to say, but I want to come back in now and finish it, as it were. And it was difficult.
What
Sorry.
point did you end it? Did you cut it off?
I cut
What
it
were we
off
talking about?
several sentences after you asked us to keep it confidential. What you were about to say confidential.
But he didn't say that. He said, anyway, okay. So
Well,
we've got
that's
none of,
what it sounded
we've got
like
none
to
of
me.
this. We've got none of this on tape.
You got some of it, but not much. Just the beginning part, but not the end part, and I think the end part is good.
Yeah.
But it was hard to know when to come back in. I'm
If
sorry.
you have a problem in future or now,
Mm-hmm.
before you turn it off, just ask, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because I actually think what we had was wonderful, and
Mm-hmm.
now we don't have it. So,
Actually, there must have been a misunderstanding, because I
yeah,
did not ask for
he
anything
did
to
not.
become
He did not
confidential.
say you misunderstood it completely.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
Then. Yeah.
Okay, so let's try and go through it again. Just hang on before you turn it back on. I just want to try and reframe it. I'd asked you, we're going to start back about being sober for
Yeah, okay.
for about 30 years. You
Right.
said your 30-year
Right.
anniversary would be August of this year.
Yes,
And
one day at a time.
it's one day at a time, but also you made it sound so easy in a way, and I know it wasn't.
It wasn't easy.
Could you perhaps talk a little bit about the experience of doing it, how it came to pass, and also do you have a family history of it,
Oh.
or whatever? So we could just
So
kind of...
why don't we start with the family history of it first?
Okay.
Okay, well, as you may know, if you've read anything about it, or you know the dynamics of families, often dysfunction such as alcoholism get buried, and there's families are very secretive about these things that go on. And that it turned out that in my particular case, it wasn't until I was in my in recovery in my early 40s that I actually learned about the family history vis-a-vis alcohol. But I did remember that when I was about 13 years old, my mother got suddenly called away to go up to Ontario from Nova Scotia because her brother, much older brother, had suddenly died. And then a couple of years later, the same thing, another much older brother had suddenly died. And, you know, whisper, 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 et cetera, et cetera. But as kids, we didn't have a clue exactly what happened, except they died, and it was kind of tragic, sudden, tragic. And it was only when I started pumping actually not my mother, my mother's older sister in Barrie, Ontario, visiting her in early recovery, that I started to piece together that there had been serious alcoholism in the family. It turned out that these two older brothers that had died suddenly, Uncle Fred had checked himself into a hotel in Toronto and blew his brains out with a gun. He was an alcoholic. And then a couple of years later, my Uncle Ken, his younger brother, died in Windsor, Ontario, choking to death on his own vomit after a binge. And then it came out that my mother's father, he was an alcoholic, and he died of esophageal cancer at the age of 59 after a life of drinking alcohol and smoking cigars. And I also learned that he had at one point gone into hospital in Guelph for what was called the cure.
I remember the cure, yes.
And so that's the family history. On my father's side, his mother, they're Irish, Brady's, There were alcoholics, there were known alcoholics in the family as well. Of course, growing up, none of this, that should be enough.
So,
And also, even if I'd known intellectually, I don't know if it would have made any difference to me, although the light might have gone on sooner that maybe I had a problem with alcohol. It wasn't until I was confronted by that woman that I mentioned that I actually, that particular day, at that particular time, I thought, oh, this is it. This is something I have to look at. And that's when I read that book, and that's when I contacted the Royal Ottawa Hospital and ended up in rehab ultimately.
Could you talk about the book? You said you read
Well,
the
I
book.
just, after this woman confronted me and said, Shaun, is there a problem with alcohol? Because she had this accent. I was surprised by her question, but I knew what she meant. No, but I wasn't sure why she asked me that question, because we'd spent the weekend drinking wine and having fun. But she had smelled alcohol in my breath at an inappropriate time.
Okay.
And because the next day in the morning, because I had the shakes, I actually drank some wine to get rid of the shakes. And that's what brought it all home. And where was I going?
You had apparently you read a book. I was
well,
interested in
okay,
the book.
then after this woman asked me that question, and I looked, I realized that she had a point. There just happened to be a book around the house that was put out by the World Health Organization way back in around 1960 or something. This was the one that defined alcoholism as a disease, okay? And I read that book cover to cover that day, stayed home from work, and I realized, oh my God, I'm an alcoholic. This is what I think is wrong with me. I think I'm an alcoholic. And that's what...
And that came as a
Well,
revelation.
I never thought in those terms, yeah, alcoholic, no, not me. It never even crossed my mind. But all of a sudden the light went on, oh, God, maybe I'm an alcoholic. Instead of a very depressed person.
And how come you had a book on alcoholism if you had
Because, yeah, very good question. My drinking had been an issue in my relationship, and my wife, ex-wife now, had actually checked that up in the library and never returned the book.
Okay.
And somehow I still had this book with me.
But it came as an opportune time because you
Yes.
had something to read.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but she wasn't even there then, but somehow I had this book at my place too. I wonder
Wow.
why. It's interesting.
The
why we
world,
even
the
have
universe
that book.
is strange. Sometimes it
Yeah.
gives us a kick in the pants when we need it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you read the book. You
So, yeah, I ended up I called the Royal Ottawa Hospital, their addiction center, and within a few weeks I was in detox, 5 days of detox, followed by a 28-day program where I was introduced to AA and just, and then started my recovery. Now, the first 5 years of recovery is it's fundamental change to one's life, how one deals with things, etc. But I being the kind of person I am, I went into it total immersion, right? So they said you're supposed to do 90 meetings in 90 days to make sure it takes. I did 120 in 90 days, okay?
Oh my goodness.
So I really knew I was going to have to be changed fundamentally because I had just used alcohol to deal with life. And I had to find out other ways. And I knew if I went to these meetings, somehow I had seen enough people that had gone to these meetings long enough that something had changed in them. So I knew if I went, sure enough, guess what? It did.
And so basically AA was a program that worked for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
And do you still go to meetings?
Up until about 3 weeks ago, I went to the St. Matthias meeting here in Westmount. I guess the first 5 or 10 years, I went to at least 1 or 2 meetings a week. Well, I told you early days, 120 and 90 days, but the last few years, I just go every couple of months just to sort of keep in touch and as a reminder of who I am and where I came from. It's not like I'm not white knuckling it anymore, because I've been sober more of my life than I ever drank.
Well, that's wonderful news.
However, if I took a drink today,
You'd be right back.
by all accounts, yes.
Were you a spirit man or a wine man or a beer man or all of them?
No, I was beer and wine mostly.
Okay. I had a friend who was an alcoholic, and he said, I'm not an alcoholic because I don't drink beer. So it's like...
Actually, the heavy-duty alcoholics drink whiskey.
I know, but it was always quite funny. That was always his...
Another level of denial, right?
Yes. But
Okay.
one of the interesting things I thought that you mentioned was the fact that alcohol being a depressant, but you didn't realize it was a depressant, so you were depressed at times, and what you found out was once you got rid of the alcohol, you actually got rid of the depression,
Exactly.
which was a nice thing,
Right.
a good side effect in some ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But then I also, in conjunction with, becoming sober and not drinking, I made a lot of other lifestyle changes. So like exercise became a regular part of my life, okay, and it still is. And so exercise is a great remover of depression also, okay? So I've never been clinically depressed, since I stopped drinking, and it's a combination of not ingesting alcohol plus a regular exercise regime.
And you also found that it helped you realized that you'd been not always, but part of it, you were in an unhappy marriage and you were using alcohol to cope, and you realized when you were no longer in your unhappy marriage and you'd moved on with your life, that all of that made it a bit easier.
Yes.
Yeah. And exercise and lifestyle changes, did you change your diet? Is there any advice? What did you do, or as far as exercises and diet?
Well, I would say that the key to, in my opinion, based on everything I've read, my own personal experience, what I see around me, if there's one thing that a person can do to improve their mental and physical and spiritual health, it's regular exercise. It starts there. If you do that, all of the other stuff will come. And so I work out and play squash 5 days a week, either working out or playing squash. And I'll be playing squash at 3:30 today. I'll be on the squash court at the downtown Y.
And how did you get to play squash? It's not... I grew up after university playing squash, but it's not a sort of in sport so much.
I was actually introduced to it by my ex-wife, who's from India, as I mentioned, because she grew up, belonging to a club in India where they played squash. So she was trying to get us involved in activities, and she dragged me to the squash court one day. But I didn't, I was exposed to it with her, but I didn't. I really got into it with a buddy I worked with a couple of years after that. But this is when I was still drinking. So we would play squash and then have a few beers, right? But then later on, then it became a game I loved and a game I just continued to play, and I continued to play it.
And you played in Ottawa?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then when you moved to Montreal, you continued playing. And where did you play?
Well, I was a member for the first 15 years here in Montreal. I belonged to the Delta of President Kennedy. They have a health club there with 2 squash courts. It was very close to where I worked at the time. So I played there for 15 years. About 3 years ago, things were going downhill at at the Delta, and they had been for a long time actually. And then I switched to the Y, the downtown Y. They have 5 squash courts. I love it there. I wish I had switched there many years before, because the Delta was kind of very small, inward-looking, parochial, whereas the Y is very international. I played with squash people in many different countries. It's just a happening place, And the Delta was dying there.
And you, when we spoke on the phone, you, prior to this interview, you had told me that it was the time that once a year the squash pros came to Montreal, and it was something
that
that
happened
you,
last week,
that you enjoy doing, and you see the international players and everything. Could you speak a little bit about the enjoyment you get from that?
Well,
Watching good squash players.
Well, it's like seeing the game played at the highest level. And last week, I just went to the semifinals, so I saw the best 4 players in last week's tournament play. And ultimately the guy who won the tournament, I saw him play there, because he won his semifinal. And it's just the joy of seeing a game played at the very highest level it's played at. And so once a year, the pros come into Montreal. It's not an A-level tournament, so it's not, you won't get the top 5 players, but you'll get guys, ranked 15th, 20th, whatever, top players in the world. And so it's very enjoyable for that reason. So I've been going every year for years. It's usually held at the MAA.
I know, when I was a member of the MAA after university, it was the time that the Khan family reigned supreme,
Yeah, right.
and they come to Montreal, and I understand what you mean when you see top quality squash, because it's unbelievable. So at what point did you realize that dream you had of maybe becoming a squash professional wasn't?
No, I never really entertained that dream, no. I've just always been a recreational player, but I have improved. I've even improved since I came to Montreal.
Yeah. Well, squash has always been quite a game here, I know that.
Right.
Yeah.
But part of it is fitness. Well, a big part of it is fitness. So the top players in the world, they are among the fittest athletes in the world, okay?
You mentioned that, in my time it was Indian players and British players that were top of the podium, but I believe you mentioned that at the moment it's Egyptian players, both male and female, which kind of blew me away, because you'd think of Egypt and being a Muslim country and one thing and another, the women, but I was very...
I've never researched it, but I think they come from Cairo. I think they come from wealthy families that belong to clubs that have squash courts.
Okay.
And I think it just caught on there. There's a little circle of these rich kids that play squash. And somehow they've bred, all these very good squash players.
And so you work out. Do you have a sports facility in your condo?
There's a gym.
In the building.
Gym in my condo. So I work out 3 times a week in the gym in my condo, and other 2 times I go to the Y and play squash.
Okay. And do you have a pool on top of your building?
Yeah, but that's only open.
Oh, just in the
and
summer.
I'm not really a swimmer. I just a person I would dive in to cool off, but I don't swim lanes. No, I've never liked struggling for breath. I'm a runner. I still run.
Oh, you still run? Oh,
yeah.
good.
Well, actually, every summer I run outside.
Do you run along the canal, or?
No, I run from my place partly along the canal and into Old Montreal. I do a loop through Old Montreal and back. So it's a very, very nice run. And for the last 5 or 6 years, my daughter and I have every August, there's this run that happens in Lachine on a beautiful flat course that goes out in the point there in Lachine in the park. And it's for Alzheimer's.
It's a great, that park is amazing.
So we've been running in that for the last 5 or 6 years now.
So father-son, father-daughter.
Well, the first 3 years we ran the same event. Now she runs the 5K, I run the 2K. I'm just running the 2K always against the best time I can do, okay?
We took a little break there, but if we could perhaps just finish up on a couple of things.
All right.
You had mentioned your time at the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, and I believe that was about the time that we had, basically what was the biggest terrorist act committed initially on Canadian soil, and that involved Canadians, and that was the Air India crash. And I believe that was during the time you were there, so I was wondering if you could give us a little update on, did you have any particular involvement in that, or did you have a role to play in the investigation afterwards?
Yeah, it just so happens that I was directly involved in that Air India, or the aftermath of the Air India crash, which actually, that happened June 23rd, 1985. It was an Air India registered aircraft flying over the Irish Sea, just off the coast of Ireland, and it suddenly came down. Just a sudden, catastrophic event happened in the air. At the time, of course, they didn't know exactly what happened. However, there were, from the get-go, because it was just a sudden catastrophic event in mid-air at 39,000 feet, or 31,000 feet, I think, the immediate thought comes to mind of a possible bomb, okay? However, that was just a suspicion at the time. It was treated as an ordinary, well, a major crash. Canada, because there were a lot of Canadian citizens involved, and that qualified Canada under international law as an interested party in the investigation. So we immediately sent our investigators over there.
To India or to Ireland?
No, to the place where the crash happened.
Off the coast of Ireland?
To be involved in the immediate response, the recovery of the first pieces of wreckage, to try to recover the black boxes, which are orange actually.
We know that.
The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorders, and also other wreckage. And we had already done a lot of recoveries before from underwater. And this was new to the Indians, actually. They did not have a very strong capability at all in accident investigation or recovery of wreckage or anything like that. But they had to invite us because they, under international law, since it was Indian registered aircraft, it was their investigation. Okay, so Canada went over as an invited party, as an invited interested party. And because we had a lot of expertise, we got heavily involved in the recovery. Anyway, after 2 or 3 weeks of recovery over there, our investigators over there, they had recovered the major parts of the wreckage. They had recovered the 2 black boxes. All of that stuff automatically went back to India. I was flown back, went back by ship. However, now by this time, in back channels, the RCMP was involved, okay, because there was a suspicion of terrorism, and they were doing initial tests on the wreckage as it was recovered, and although it had to be confirmed, they felt that there was signs of a possible explosion, okay, just the way the aircraft exploded, but they sent these pieces of wreckage out for testing to see if they could find explosive chemicals on the wreckage itself, which they eventually did, which confirmed that there was a bomb. But anyway, all this was fluid at the time, okay? But we had in Canada a state-of-the-art lab, aircraft accident investigation lab, the most advanced in the world at the time, that could analyze cockpit voice recorders, data recorders on aircraft, plus analyze parts of the wreckage as well. So Canada was lobbying very heavily with the Indian governments to say, look, why don't you let us examine these things in our lab? We'll take care of them. We will give the results back to the Indian government because you're going to run the investigation. So there was a lot of diplomatic stuff going on through diplomatic channels, and through criminal investigation channels, Interpol, etc., RCMP. And anyway, our investigators had been talking to the investigators, and by now they were in Bombay. And a lot of the wreckage was in Bombay. The black boxes were in Bombay. And our senior investigators were over there. They had gone from Ireland to Bombay, but they could not get the Indians to agree to this, okay? So after a couple of weeks of trying, our guys wanted to come back because they'd been away for a month or something. They weren't getting anywhere with the Indians. At that time, there was a very strong, prior to the crash even, India had a very kind of strong nationalistic bent over a number of years, so they would like to do everything themselves, okay? So you had to really sort of talk to them sort of carefully about how you offered, why you were offering to do this, etc. Anyway, long story short, I was called into my executive director's office one day at the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, and they also knew I knew India, because it just so happened, as I talked earlier, a few years before I'd been married in India, and I knew the country a bit. But also, I was the senior advisor to the executive director. And so they asked me if I would be willing to go over there and to try to negotiate with the Indians, whoever's in charge over there of this investigation, to see if they will allow Canada to have the access to the flight data recorder and the black box, the voice recorder for analysis in the lab in Ottawa.
Were you negotiating directly with the Indian government
that's
or
what I'm
the
gonna tell
Indian
you.
Transportation Safety
No,
Board, or did they have one?
No, they didn't really have a transportation safety board. They had like an equivalent Department of Transport. But what happened is that this was a major accident as far as India was concerned, Air India aircraft. And by this time, it was pretty well believed it was an act of terrorism. So they appointed a judge of the Delhi High Court to oversee the whole investigation that would culminate in a public inquiry, okay? So what happened is I went over to Bombay, and I spent 2 or 3 days in Bombay dealing with the sort of our investigative counterparts in Bombay. Wasn't making too much progress with them, and there was a handover from our guy who was there, to me. So after a couple of days, it was clear that all the action had moved to New Delhi, where this judge was, because he was just appointed right around that time, Judge Kripal of the Delhi High Court. So now the way I would communicate this was the day long before the internet, right? And also because this was involved possible terrorism and criminality, etc., all of our communications had to be secure. And so when I wanted to talk to my counterparts in Ottawa, my bosses, I would have to write these long telexes, and they would have to go through an encryption machine. So in Bombay, in the hotel in Bombay, the RCMP was there, and they were guarding a hotel suite where there was an encryption machine operator from Canada.
Do we still have those? Is
No,
that
I doubt if they use these machines anymore because of the software now, right?
Oh, okay,
But,
yes.
but anyway, it was interesting because every time I would have a telex, I would have to, take my handwritten telex to this door of this hotel room, and the RCMP guy would answer the door, and I would look in over his shoulder, etc., and I could see that there was a machine, like a big machine, like a piano.
Wow.
And it was covered with a blanket. And they wouldn't, I saw, little bits of it, with the blanket coming on or off. And then this operator would operate, and this encryption machine had been taken over by diplomatic bag, right? So things that go in by a diplomatic bag between countries, they don't go through the security of the other countries,
That's right.
Anyway, this thing had been taken this was apparently standard procedure in those days. Anyway, long story short, back and forth telexes to my bosses in Ottawa, found out that Judge Kripal had been appointed in New Delhi, so I was authorized to fly to Delhi, where I ended up being allocated an office in the Canadian High Commission, where Justin Trudeau just was a couple of weeks ago. I just wore my Western clothes when I was there.
That's a nice little dig. That's a nice little dig.
Anyway,
So did the government, the President of France.
I stayed with my in-laws when I was in New Delhi, and when I did come home I would change in my kurta pajamas, which was the traditional Indian garb, right? They were just so comfortable. Anyway, so I was allocated an office in the Canadian High Commission. I was allocated a driver who would pick me up. Basically, so what happened over a period of 7 to 10 days, somewhere in there, a driver would pick me up at a certain time every day, take me to the High Commission, and then in a particular where I do some work, where I draft my telexes back to my bosses because of the time difference, right, about a 12-hour time difference, something. And then I would go to, the driver would take me at the appointed time every day to the chambers of Judge Kirpal in the Delhi High Court. And I would go to his chambers and meet with him, and we would discuss. I would explain to him all the reasons why this would be a good thing for them to return these black boxes, etc., to Canada. And then, you know, we'd have a nice cordial meeting over tea, and then we'd agree to get together again. And so, anyway, the thing that finally swung it, well, he was being very sort of careful, cards to the chest, etc., but it was known, and it was well known that Canada was the expert in this area, and that India didn't really have the facilities. But as I say, it was very sensitive because of the criminality involved, and also the national pride of the Indians. However, the thing that swung it for us, that got him to agree, was that he had been appointed the head of this commission in India to investigate this whole crash and act of espionage and everything, and they knew they were going to hold a public inquiry, which they had never done. Well, it just so happened that over the previous year, since the Canadian Aviation Safety Board was new, the new chairman and board members, after it was created in 1984, were very keen to hold public inquiries, independent public inquiries, for the first time in Canadian history, right? So they held 3. It just so happened that I was the person who organized those public inquiries. Not only did I organize them, but I was tasked with writing a manual on how to run a public inquiry for the Canadian Aviation Safety Board that covered everything.
Yeah, you mentioned that before, yes.
Well, anyway, it just so happened that I had my latest draft of that document in my briefcase with me when I went to India for airplane reading. So when I reached the point after 7 or 8 days, or 6 or 7 days, talking to the judge at the Delhi High Court, I had, the night before, I had telexed my bosses, and I said, look, I have this report with me. I have a feeling if I offer this report to the judge, because basically it tells him from A to Z how to run a public inquiry, and he doesn't have a clue how to do it. I have a feeling if I offer this to him, it's going to turn it for us. I did offer it to him, and then the next day, he said, don't worry, Canada's going to get what they want. And at the High Commission, we had a copy made, and okay. So that was the thing.
It didn't go through the encryption machine.
No, exactly. So he got my draft copy of this document that told him A to Z how to run a public inquiry, which I'm sure he used when he did the one in India. I didn't even go to the one when it happened in India. Some of our people did. And so anyway, so that was kind of an exciting chapter.
Well, yes, and you got the black box, and they came back. And
Yes.
did they eventually go back to India? Those black boxes. What happens to those?
Well, they analyze them. They open them up. They're certain parameters are recorded on tape and otherwise, and they know they have software and experts who analyze it, and then they prepare a report. And those reports went to India, went to Judge Kirpal. Whether physically the flight recorders
You don't know
went
what
back to
happens.
India or not.
I always wondered about that.
They could have been sent back to India.
Yeah. So that was your major involvement with the Air India, because after that it became a criminal case that went
Exactly.
on and has never really been solved.
Right.
I mean, only
Right.
one person was held accountable, and that was
For
really just for making the bomb.
Indigent
Yeah, and there's a lot of other, there's a lot of documentation out there, but the true story, I guess, is never really,
Right.
or the people were
No,
never
this
really
was
held
just-
responsible.
This was just
Yeah.
my little part before the criminal investigation
Yeah.
really got underway.
Do you have any other stories about your time in the transportation safety world?
Well, as I told you, I organized the first 3 or 4 major public inquiries for the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, and I was able to use that report.
I'm thinking
with the
more,
judge, but
no,
the-
I'm thinking
but
more
after-
about later
but later,
crashes
yeah,
and things.
After I left the transportation, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board lasted for 5 years, and it had been sort of a pilot to see how an independent investigation board would work, it transitioned into the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, which became multimodal. So I, of course, transitioned from one to the other. And so the last 7 years I was in the Ottawa area, I was working for the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. It just so happened, and after I left, I was still in touch with the executive director there, and he asked me to do a couple of consulting contracts after the fact, because I left there in 1996 or 97, moved to Montreal, and in around 2000, he contacted me and asked me if I would do a review of the entire investigation project into the investigation of the Swiss Air Crash 111 off Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia that happened in, I think, June 2nd, 1998. Early June 98, I believe. They were about almost 2 years into that investigation when he asked me to get involved, because he says, things are going very slowly now. We need someone to go in there and look at this thing as a project and see what's happening, what needs to be done. So, so I did that, a contract for them. And that was kind of interesting because it involved me going down to Shearwater, Nova Scotia. That's on the just off of Halifax Harbour. It's a small.
I think there's a lot of information about it. Yes.
But anyway, there was a hangar A. And the first day I walked into this hangar A, it's a massive hangar. It was completely empty of aircraft, but it was chock full of wreckage from the entire Swiss Air Crash. They recovered more than 2 million pieces of wreckage, okay, if you count each individual piece they recovered. It was spread over this entire hangar, okay? And parts of the fuselage, parts of the cockpit area, for example, where it had actually been rebuilt too, reconstructed on these forms where they rebuilt the cockpit, okay? So that was interesting in the sense that I did get in a close look at that investigation and where it was at and where it was going, and I made a number of recommendations to senior management about how to sort of fast track the investigation, because it was obviously going to already pass the 2-year mark from the time of the incident, and they weren't going to make the 2-year mark to have a final report out. So I was telling them how they could get it under 3 years. So essentially they asked me to do that. So that was another interesting anecdote on an international accident.
Any others that you can recall?
No, that's
big enough. It's 2 major crashes, which Canada was, very high profile. I was actually working for IATA at the time of the Swiss Air one, so. Was Shearwater by any chance, remember you'd lived in Nova Scotia,
right.
So was that where your father was based or not?
No, not exactly, but when we moved to the Halifax Dartmouth area from Greenwood, my dad was at Maritime Air Command, which was across Halifax Harbour, office buildings across Halifax Harbour, but when he did his, the flying he had to do to keep up his credentials, he would fly out of Shearwater.
Ah, okay. I was wondering where the connection, because it was Shearwater and Greenwood and well, we're drawing to a close. Do you have anything else? You mentioned further back in our talk that you had a brother and a sister, but you didn't mention their names.
I guess I did. Well, I think I was mentioning that I'm the oldest of 3 kids.
That's right.
Air Force family brought up in Nova Scotia. I have a sister. Well, my sister passed away in 1996. My sister Ellen, and I have a brother who now lives in Gatineau, which used to be Hull, Quebec. He worked for the government for many years. He's retired now.
What did he do?
He was IT specialist.
Oh, so you both you started out in IT and he...
Yeah, but that's essentially all he had a career in IT,
Okay.
yeah.
So he was following in the footsteps of his big brother?
Well,
Not really.
well, in a sense, yeah, because
Yeah.
I was the one who actually talked him into getting involved in IT in the first place.
Yeah,
okay?
I wondered, yeah.
But anyway, he's had a pretty simple career path, just stayed with the government in various IT positions in a couple of different departments. And he has 2 sons who are in their early 20s now, and his wife is still, she's a big director with Revenue Canada. She's Director General now with Revenue Canada. My sister Ellen, who passed away in 1996, Ellen she was quite interesting. She was an artist from the time she was a teenager, like a painter. She went on to become a painter, sculptor.
Was she modern art or figurative, or what was her style?
Well, ultimately, she became a performance artist, okay? The last few years of her time before she died. But printmaking became one of her favorite things to do, okay? She did a lot of printmaking. She would make prints of pieces of clothing and stuff and hang them on a clothesline or things like that. But also she got heavily into performance art. But when she was in her early to mid 20s, she was appointed the very first director of Saw Gallery in Ottawa. Now Saw Gallery is a parallel gallery, what they call a parallel gallery. It's a non-commercial gallery where they can do experimental things that commercial galleries wouldn't necessarily do because the art is not there just to sell to people.
Okay.
So she became
I never heard that term before.
Oh yeah, she became the founding director of Saw Gallery. It's parallel gallery.
SAW?
SAW, and it stands for Sussex Artworks because it was originally located on Sussex Drive in Ottawa. It's now in the market area, the Byward market area of Ottawa, and it's still operating all these years later. Anyway, Ellen was director there, founding director, and she operated as director for 2 or 3 years.
So this would be in which years?
Oh, this was back in the mid-70s, mid to late 70s.
Okay.
And then she ended up in, dabbling in various forms of art. She was also a poet, by the way.
And when you did performance art, what did she do? Could you give us an example of her art? I mean, was it poetry with images, or was it digital, or a bit of everything?
Well, it was sometimes poetry with images or objects. She usually had some sort of a message, antisocial sort of message to it, or social critique going on. One time, she and her, now I don't know the details of the meaning of all of her art she did, but one thing she did a couple of years before she left Ottawa was she and her friend Judy Robertson, who was also an artist who worked out of Saw Gallery, they both created uniforms for themselves that were half black and half white, and they walked around downtown Ottawa with placards that were half black and half white with some message on them, but I forget what it was. But anyway, she did
But they created quite a stir.
Provocative things that sometimes got into the newspaper. But anyway, she ended up she got married an artist slash architect, or architect slash artist. They ended up in Toronto, and anyway, during that time, Ellen she was in her early 40s. She was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of breast cancer.
Yes, you told us about that, yeah.
And she passed away within a few months of diagnosis in Toronto. That was 1996. That was just after I moved to Montreal, actually. She had talked about coming to visit me in Montreal, but that didn't happen. Anyway.
Well, I don't really want to end on a sad note, but I think we've covered an awful lot of topics. What was your brother's name, by the way?
Oh, sorry, Ian.
Ian.
Ian Fawcett, and
we might as well
my
have all
sister is
that.
Ellen Fawcett.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, because Ellen was a performance artist, I think I told you early in the interview, I was got involved in this whole Leonard Cohen project.
Yes, that's
Well,
right.
It was when I was considering whether I was even going to get involved in that, because they were looking for men who wanted to be involved in some sort of performance thing involving singing and video
Yeah, I
cameras and
remember,
things
yeah.
like that. That was kind of out of character for me, actually. So I felt Ellen was guiding me. And as a matter of fact, I asked Candace Breach, the artist who has done this installation, I asked her if she would credit Ellen. So if you look at the card of credits for the art piece, art installation, it says Shaun Fawcett, and then in memory of Ellen and Christine Fawcett.
Oh, lovely.
Because, yeah, it was Ellen who died.
Well, that's a lovely way to end. So we've covered so many topics. We've gone through your life, I think, with the Finds the Shoes Comb. I'm sure there's lots of other stuff that we could come up with, but I'd like to thank you. I'm sure it's been quite a wonderful experience, and thank you very, very much for participating.
You're welcome. Thank you,
Thank
Margaret.
you.